The advertisement was 4 lines long. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Blackridge Ranch, Garnett County, Montana Territory. Room and board included. Inquire by post only. No references required. Clara Whitmore had read those 4 lines so many times the newspaper had begun to soften along the fold. She'd read them on the floor of her aunt's kitchen the morning she found the eviction notice slipped under the door. She'd read them again on the bench outside the bank, where a clerk with a thin mustache and no particular sympathy had explained that her father's debts had consumed everything. The house on Birch Street, the furniture, the small savings account her mother had kept hidden in a ceramic pot shaped like a rooster. Gone. All of it gone, absorbed into the estate of a man who had died owing more than he'd ever owned. She was 24 years old and she had $11.30 to her name. The train ride from Billings took most of a day, and Clara spent it watching the land change outside the window. The scrubby outskirts of town giving way to open grass, then rolling hills, then something larger and more serious that she didn't have a word for. Mountains appeared in the north, blue and white and indifferent. The sky above them was enormous. She had grown up in a river town where the horizon was always interrupted by something. A building, a tree line, a church steeple. Out here, there was nothing to interrupt anything, and the openness of it made something in her chest feel strange. Not quite fear, not quite hope, something in between. The man beside her on the train was traveling to Garnett County to see about a mining claim. He had rough hands and a friendly manner, and when he asked what brought her out this way, Clara told him she was going to work at a ranch. "Which ranch?" he said. "Blackridge." The man looked at her for a moment, then looked back out the window. "Ah," he said, and didn't ask anything else. Clara noted this and filed it away. What? The stage from the county seat took another 3 hours, and by the time it let her off at the crossroads outside Garnett, the afternoon light had gone long and golden, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched halfway across the road. A boy of about 12 was waiting with a wagon, slouched on the seat like he'd been sitting there since morning. "You the new cook?" he said. "I am," Clara said. "I'm Pete," he said. He didn't move to help with her bag, so she lifted it herself and climbed up beside him. He smelled like horses and something burnt, possibly singed hair, and he had the kind of face that suggested he'd been in trouble recently and expected to be in more. "How far is the ranch?" Clara asked. "About an hour." He clucked at the horses and the wagon lurched forward. "You cook biscuits?" "I do." "Good ones?" "I've been told so." He seemed to consider this seriously. Mr. Mercer's last cook made them like stones. Couldn't hardly eat them without thinking about your back teeth. That sounds unpleasant. It was. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't last long anyway. Neither did the one before her. Clara looked at the boy. "How many cooks has Mr. Mercer had?" Pete squinted at the sky, apparently counting. "Since Mrs. Mercer passed, I think 4. Maybe 5 if you count the one who only stayed 2 weeks. Mr. Garrett don't think she counts." "Who's Mr. Garrett?" "Foreman. He's been here longer than anybody." Pete paused. "He's all right. Most of the men are all right. It's just—" He stopped himself, seemed to decide something. "You'll see," he said, and didn't offer anything more. Clara turned back to watch the road. The land on either side of it was serious and vast. Cattle grazed in the middle distance, small, dark shapes against yellow grass. The mountains she'd seen from the train were closer now, and she could see the first snow on their peaks even though it was only early September. She thought about the eviction notice and the bank clerk and the ceramic rooster, and she made herself stop thinking about those things and instead look at the mountains. She was here. That was what mattered. She was here. She had her 2 hands, and she was not going back. Blackridge Ranch came into view just as the sun touched the western ridge. The house first, 2-storied and wide-porched, built of dark timber that had weathered to gray. Then the barns and outbuildings fanning out behind it, and the corrals, and the bunkhouse with smoke already threading from its chimney. It was a working ranch in the plainest possible sense. Nothing about it was decorative. The porch railings needed paint. One of the barn doors hung crooked on its hinges. The flower beds along the front of the house were empty. Whatever had grown there long since gone to seed and blown away. But the bones of it were solid, and Clara recognized the difference between neglect and ruin. This was neglect. Something had simply stopped caring, and caring was a thing that could be resumed. Pete pulled up in front of the house and a man came out from the barn. Not the man she'd expected, because she'd expected some version of the men she'd known in town. Men with soft hands who wore their authority lightly. This man was not that. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, moving with the particular economy of someone who had spent years doing physical work and had gotten efficient at it. Dark hair going gray at the temples. A face that had seen weather. He walked toward the wagon with his hands in his pockets and stopped a few feet away and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not hostile, not welcoming, just appraising. Like she was an animal he was trying to determine the soundness of. "You're the cook?" he said. "Clara Whitmore," she said, and climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. "Dane Mercer." He didn't extend his hand. "I expected someone older." "The advertisement didn't specify age," Clara said. Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, not quite irritation. "No," he said. It didn't. He was looking at her bag, then back at her, the assessment still running. "You've cooked for a ranch before?" "I've cooked for large households," she said. "I can work. I'm not delicate and I'm not slow, and I don't complain about hours. If that's what you need to know, that's what I can tell you." A pause. From the barn behind him came the sound of horses shifting, something being moved, someone's voice low and unintelligible. "Kitchen's through the back," Dane Mercer said. "Pete'll show you." And that was that. He turned and walked back toward the barn, and Clara stood in the yard with her bag at her feet and watched him go. Pete appeared beside her. "See?" he said, apparently feeling vindicated about something he hadn't fully said earlier. "He's direct," Clara said. "That's one word for it," said Pete. "Mom." The kitchen was large, which was the best thing about it, and dirty, which was the worst. The stove needed blacking. The shelves were stocked in a haphazard way that suggested whoever had last organized them had done it in a hurry or a bad mood. Dishes were clean but badly stacked. A calendar on the wall was 2 years out of date. Clara stood in the middle of the room for a moment, turning slowly, taking inventory. There was an older woman sitting at the table, 60s, iron-haired, watching Clara with frank curiosity. She introduced herself as Mrs. Eldon, who came in 3 days a week from town to do laundry. "I've been holding things together since the last one left," Mrs. Eldon said. "That was 6 weeks ago." "What happened to her?" Clara asked. "Said it was too lonely." Mrs. Eldon folded her hands on the table. The one before her said the same thing. "This ranch—" She paused. "It gets into you, the quiet does. And Mr. Mercer isn't what you'd call easy company." "I noticed," Clara said. She was already going through the pantry, assessing. "You'll need to know a few things," Mrs. Eldon said, in a tone that suggested she was going to tell them whether Clara asked or not. "He eats early, before the men. He doesn't talk at breakfast. He doesn't drink, not since—" She stopped. "He doesn't drink. He doesn't take well to people fussing over him. He'll ride out at first light, and some days you won't see him until supper, and even then he might eat and go directly to his study. He's not—" She seemed to be searching for the right word. "He's not a cruel man. He's just absent. Like something happened to him that moved him a little to the side of the world, and he's been there ever since." Clara closed the pantry and turned around. "Thank you," she said. "That's useful." Mrs. Eldon looked at her steadily. "You're not going to ask what happened?" "He'll tell me if he wants to," Clara said. "Or he won't. Either way, I'm here to cook and keep the house." Mrs. Eldon studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded, just once. "Good," she said. She started dinner that first evening with what was on hand: beans and salt pork, cornbread made from a bag of meal she found in the back of the pantry, a pot of coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. It wasn't impressive, but it was hot, and it was plenty. And the ranch hands who filed in through the back ate with the concentrated focus of men who had been making do for 6 weeks. There were 7 of them. Pete, who she'd already met. Mr. Garrett, the foreman, who was 50-something and weathered to leather, and had eyes that missed nothing. A man named Hobb, who was missing 2 fingers on his left hand and was consequently the most interesting-looking person at the table. 2 brothers named Alvaro and Diego, who spoke English when they chose to, and Spanish between themselves. A young man named Kale, who had a bad scar along his jaw and wouldn't look directly at Clara, and an older hand named Roy, who ate with the methodical devotion of someone for whom eating was a moral act. Dane Mercer did not eat with them. His plate was set at the small table in the side room off the kitchen, a compromise arrangement, Clara gathered, that had developed at some point and hardened into custom. He came in without announcement, poured himself coffee, and sat. From where she stood at the stove, she could see him through the doorway. He ate without looking up. He didn't seem to notice her. She told herself this was preferable to someone who was underfoot. When he was done, he carried his plate to the kitchen himself, which she hadn't expected. Set it in the basin without a word, then looked up and caught her watching him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "It was adequate," he said. "I'll know what I'm working with by tomorrow," Clara said. "It'll be better." He looked at her for another beat, that same appraising look from the yard, and then he was gone. She heard the creak of the stairs, then nothing. "High praise," Garrett said from the other room, loud enough for her to hear. A couple of the men laughed quietly. Her room was off the back of the house, small but private, with a window that looked out over the north pasture. The first night she lay on the narrow bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling, horses moving in the barn, something moving in the dark outside. The particular quality of silence that large open land has, which is not really silence at all, but many small sounds stitched together into something that feels like silence until you've lived with it long enough to hear the pieces. She thought about her father's house, the weight of the last few years, his illness first, slow and grinding, then his death, then the unraveling of the finances, the estate attorney who had the look of a man who delivered bad news regularly and had stopped being affected by it. She thought about her cousin Mabel, offering her the spare room in a voice that made clear how much of an imposition it would be. She thought about the bank clerk with his thin mustache, and then she made herself stop. She was 24 years old, she was in Montana, and she had a job. That was enough. It had to be. She closed her eyes and listened to the dark. The week established a rhythm. Clara rose before the hands and had the kitchen fire going by 4:30. Breakfast was on the table by 5:15. Eggs when they had them, salt pork, biscuits, oatmeal, coffee in volume. She learned quickly who wanted what. Garrett took everything. Roy ate only what was put directly in front of him. Cale didn't eat much, and she suspected he skipped meals when she wasn't watching. Pete ate with the urgency of someone who feared the food might disappear. Dane ate alone earlier, and she stopped trying to read his expressions when he collected his plate. He said almost nothing. On Wednesday, he told her the coffee was stronger than he needed it to be. She adjusted. On Friday, he said nothing at all about breakfast, which she took to mean it was acceptable. She cleaned the house from the top down. The upstairs rooms first, a guest room, a study door that was closed and that she didn't open, and then the master bedroom at the end of the hall, which she entered once, made the bed, and left as quickly as she could. The room felt, she didn't have the right word for it, suspended maybe, like a clock that had stopped and no one had gotten around to starting it again. There were things in it that clearly belonged to a woman, a brush on the vanity with a few pale hairs still caught in it, a quilt of a pattern Clara didn't recognize, worn soft with use, a pair of small, fine-boned gloves on the nightstand, as if they'd been set down in a hurry and the owner had simply never come back for them. Clara made the bed, didn't touch anything else, and went back downstairs. She asked Mrs. Eldon on her next laundry day, because Mrs. Eldon was the kind of woman who had information and would share it if asked directly. "His wife," Mrs. Eldon said. She was folding sheets with the methodical precision of long habit. Eleanor, they'd been married 4 years. She paused, held a corner of the sheet. She was expecting, 7 months along. There was a storm 2 winters after they moved here. Bad one, even for Montana. She went into labor early. By the time Dane could get a doctor out here, Mrs. Eldon pressed her lips together. He lost them both. The baby was a boy. Clara was quiet. "That was 5 years ago," Mrs. Eldon said. You can see how he's been." "Yes," Clara said. "The ranch hands say he worked himself almost to death the first year after. Wouldn't stop. Wouldn't sleep." She resumed folding. "I think he was hoping it would finish him. It didn't." Clara carried that with her the rest of the day. Not as a problem to solve. She was careful about that because she'd met people who made other people's grief into a project and it never ended well. But as something to hold in mind, a fact about the terrain, like the way the north pasture flooded when it rained. That evening, when Dane came in for his supper, she had made beef stew. Real stew. Not the watery version the last cook had apparently favored, but something with body to it, thick with root vegetables from the kitchen garden she'd started systematically raiding. There were fresh biscuits, and she'd made a pan of dried apple cake because she'd found a large amount of dried apples, and they needed to be used. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. "Smells different," he said. "I reorganized the pantry," Clara said. "There were things going to waste." He sat. She didn't hover. She went back to the main kitchen and let him eat. A while later, he appeared in the doorway with his empty bowl. "The cake," he said. "Yes?" "It's good." He looked momentarily uncomfortable, like the compliment had escaped without permission. "My mother used to make something like it." "It's a simple recipe," Clara said. "Doesn't take much." He nodded once, set the bowl in the basin, and left. She stood in the kitchen for a moment after he was gone. Something small had happened. She wasn't sure what exactly, but something. October came in cold and sharp-edged. The mountains were white halfway down now, and the mornings had a bite to them that made the kitchen fire feel essential. Clara had by this point established a system that ran quietly and well. Meals on time, the house clean and warm, the pantry restocked and organized, a kitchen garden put to bed for the winter with what she'd salvaged and what she'd grown. The men had warmed to her in the way that men on a working ranch warm to someone who feeds them well and doesn't ask too much of them socially. Garrett occasionally lingered over his coffee and talked about the ranch's history, about the winter patterns in this part of Montana, about which cattle were going to calve early. She found him easy company. Hob told jokes that were not quite appropriate and seemed deeply satisfied by her tolerance of them. Pete followed her around in the evenings when he didn't have chores, ostensibly for no reason, but transparently because he was lonely and she was there and she didn't mind. Dane was still a closed door. Not unfriendly, exactly. He had a manner that could be mistaken for coldness, but wasn't quite. It was more like he existed behind glass, present but separated. He said thank you now, reliably, for meals. Once he'd asked her if she needed anything from town and had sent Garrett with a list of provisions she'd written out. Small things. Nothing that signaled warmth so much as basic functional respect. She caught herself watching him sometimes, when he didn't know she was. The way he moved through his own house with the careful attention of someone navigating familiar space that had become unfamiliar. He touched things differently than she'd have expected. A hand on the banister. His fingers trailing along the back of a chair in the side dining room. Not absent-mindedly, but deliberately, the way you might touch something that hurt. She didn't say anything about these observations to anyone. Tippesin mom. The trouble started in the second week of October. It wasn't dramatic trouble. Not yet. It was the kind of trouble that begins quietly and doesn't announce itself until it's already done damage. Clara noticed it first in the livestock records, which she'd had occasion to look at when Garrett asked her to copy them over for legibility, and she had a natural enough eye for numbers to notice when they didn't add up. "These don't match," she said. She and Garrett were in the barn office, a small room attached to the main barn, hardly more than a closet with a desk and a lamp. He took the ledger from her and looked where she was pointing. He said. "The calves numbered in the spring tallies and the calves recorded against the fall sales don't reconcile," Clara said. "The spring count is 30 head higher than what was sold and what's currently in the herd." Garrett's face didn't change much, but she'd gotten good at reading the subtle signals. His jaw tightened, just slightly. "I'll mention it to Mr. Mercer," he said. "Do you know what accounts for the discrepancy?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "I have suspicions," he said. "It would be better coming from me to him. He doesn't take well to—" He paused, seemed to choose his words. "He's not suspicious by nature. He's trusted certain people a long time. This kind of news sits hard." "I understand," Clara said, and gave him back the ledger. She wasn't entirely sure she did understand, not the specifics, but she understood the shape of it. Someone trusted was taking from a man who was too deep in his own grief to look closely, and she understood that this was information Dane Mercer needed. and that getting it to him without destroying something in the process was the delicate part. She went back to the kitchen and made supper and didn't say anything more about it that night. The evening that changed something between them happened because of a broken milk crock. She'd left it on the edge of the shelf where it shouldn't have been, and it came down when she was reaching for the flour. It shattered on the kitchen floor, not a small piece, but a full destruction, milk and ceramic in every direction. She was on her hands and knees with a rag when she heard someone behind her. "You're going to cut yourself," said Dane's voice. "I'm being careful," Clara said without turning. "Still." He came into the kitchen properly, which he almost never did. She heard him open the cabinet under the sink where the larger rags were kept, which meant he knew where they were. And he crouched down on the other side of the mess with a rag in each hand and began cleaning from his side. They worked in silence for a moment. "I should have moved it," Clara said, mostly to fill the space. "The shelf's been uneven since—" He stopped. "For a while. I should have had Pete fix it. I'll ask him tomorrow." "I'll do it," Dane said. She glanced at him sideways. He was focused on the floor, on the pieces of the crock. His hands were careful. She'd noticed before that his hands were unusually careful for a man who worked as hard as he did. "Thank you," she said. "It's nothing." "I know." She sat back on her heels for a moment, and on a sudden impulse said, "Your wife's quilt, the one on the bed upstairs. I didn't touch it when I cleaned. I hope that was right." He stopped, was very still for a moment. "Yes," he said finally. "That was right." "I didn't know if—" She stopped herself because she hadn't fully planned out what she was saying and didn't want to stumble into something worse. "I just wanted you to know I'm careful with things." He was quiet, still not looking at her. Then he said low, "What was your family like before?" The question surprised her. She sat fully on the floor, which was perhaps undignified, and thought. "Ordinary," she said. "My mother died when I was 16. My father he meant well. He wasn't a practical man." She paused. "He thought things would work out. Usually they didn't quite, but we managed. He died last year." "I'm sorry." "So am I." She began gathering the larger pieces of the crock. "I miss him even though—" She stopped. "It's complicated, missing someone. It's not always clean." He looked at her then. It was the first time he'd looked at her directly in a conversation. Not the assessing look from the yard, but something different, something that was actually seeing her. "No," he said. "It's not." They finished cleaning up the milk and the broken crock, and when it was done, they both stood up, and neither of them had anything particularly to say. He carried the rag to the basin and washed it out, which was not a thing she'd seen him do before. "Good night," he said. "Good night," she said. After he left, she stood in the quiet kitchen for a while, listening to the house, and thought that something had shifted without either of them quite deciding to shift it. November came. The cold was serious now, the kind that had substance to it, that made the morning air feel like something you were moving through rather than breathing. The ranch contracted inward as it always did before winter. Work done closer to the buildings, fewer long rides, the rhythm changed by the light going early, and the temperature dropping fast after dark. Garrett had spoken to Dane about the ledger. Clara knew this because for 2 days Dane had a different quality of silence than usual. Not his ordinary withdrawn quiet, but something with edges in it. He rode out alone both mornings and came back late and didn't eat with the usual routine. Whatever the information had uncovered, or was in the process of uncovering, it wasn't finished yet. She didn't ask. She cooked, she cleaned, she kept the fires going, and she waited. Pete had started teaching himself to whittle at the kitchen table in the evenings, which meant he was there every night with a piece of wood and a knife and a level of conversational randomness that Clara had come to find genuinely entertaining. He was 12, apparently, or possibly 13. He wasn't entirely certain, which she found extraordinary. He was an orphan, it turned out, who had been with the ranch since he was 7. Dane had hired his older brother, who had since moved on, and Pete had simply been there when the brother left, and had never been asked to leave. "Does Mr. Mercer know you're still here?" Clara asked once, only half joking. Pete shrugged. "I think so. He doesn't say anything about it." "That's very much his way," Clara said. "Yeah." Pete examined his piece of wood critically. "He's not bad. He lets me stay. He gave me his old boots when mine wore out. He doesn't beat anybody or take their pay." He paused. "He's just not really there, like his head is somewhere else." "People grieve differently," Clara said. "My brother said he used to be different before, said he used to laugh." Pete looked up. "I never saw that. I only knew him after." Clara looked at the boy for a moment and thought about what it was to grow up alongside someone's grief without ever having seen them before it. "Hopefully you will," she said. Pete looked skeptical, but not entirely hopeless. It was late on a Thursday night when Clara heard the raised voices. She'd been in bed, not quite asleep, listening to the wind which had come up strong out of the northwest. The voices were downstairs, Dane's, and another man's she didn't recognize. She lay still for a moment, assessing. Then she got up. She put on her robe and went to the top of the stairs. The voices were in the front room. She could make out Dane's voice, low and controlled, and the other man's, higher, and with a quality she recognized, the sound of someone who's been caught and is still trying to argue their way out. She went partway down the stairs and stopped. The man was perhaps 50, heavily built, with the look of someone who spent his time indoors despite a ranching context. A man who gave orders rather than carried them out. She'd never seen him before. He was standing near the front door, hat in hand, but the hat-in-hand gesture was not apologetic. It was impatient. "The arrangement was clear," the man was saying. "The arrangement," Dane said, "is going to be reviewed by the county assessor and possibly by a lawyer." His voice was very quiet. Quieter than usual, which Clara had learned was not a calm sign. "You'll hear from me in writing." "Dane, you can go, Warren." A long silence. Clara pressed herself against the wall. The man named Warren put his hat on his head with a kind of deliberate slowness. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Get out of my house," Dane said, still quiet. Warren went. The door closed behind him. Not slammed, which was almost worse. Clara heard Dane move in the room below. She heard the sound of something being set down hard. Not thrown, but placed with significant force. Then silence. She'd stayed where she was for another minute. Then she went back upstairs and made tea, because the kitchen was off the back of the house, and she could get there without going through the front room. She made enough for two, and then she sat at the kitchen table and waited. She was on her second cup when she heard his footsteps. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her, then at the teapot. "I heard voices," she said simply. "Couldn't sleep." He came in and sat down heavily across from her. She poured him a cup without asking. He picked it up but didn't drink yet, just held it. "How much did you hear?" he said. "Not much," she said. "Enough to know it wasn't good news." He was quiet. The wind moved around the corners of the house. "The man who handles my northern leases," he said finally, "his name is Warren Colby. He's been with the family, with the ranch, for 12 years. He paused. "It appears he's been filing inaccurate reports with the county land office, adjusting terms on grazing agreements, taking money that was supposed to come to the ranch." "The ledgers," Clara said. He looked at her. "Garrett showed me some discrepancies," she said carefully. "I mentioned it to him weeks ago. I'm sorry. I should have come to you directly." Dane was quiet for a long moment. "You told Garrett," he said. "I did. I thought it should come from him. He knows the ranch's history better than I do, and I was—" She paused, decided on honesty. "I was afraid of misjudging something and causing more problem than it solved." He looked at his cup. "It wouldn't have mattered either way," he said, in a voice that had gone flat. "I've known Warren Colby since I was 20 years old. He came to the funeral. He stopped. The muscle in his jaw moved. "He helped me through the worst of it, or I thought he did." Clara said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that. "Trust," Dane said, more to himself than her, "is expensive." "Yes," she said. He sat for a while in the kitchen with his tea, and she sat across from him. And outside, the wind came down off the mountains and moved across the prairie with the impartial force of something that had been doing this long before any of them arrived and would go on doing it long after they were gone. When he finally stood up to go, he paused in the doorway. "The ledger discrepancy," he said. "You caught that in the first month." "The numbers didn't add up," Clara said. "No," he said. "They didn't." He looked at her steadily, and again she had the sense that he was actually seeing her. Not the cook, Not the person who kept the house running, but her specifically, as a person with a mind and a pair of eyes. "Thank you," he said. He left, and she sat in the kitchen for another half hour, listening to the wind. The month closed out under a sky that couldn't decide whether to snow or not, dropping cold rain in the afternoons that froze overnight into a thin crust on everything. The legal situation with Warren Colby, she gathered from Garrett's careful non-disclosures, was being handled. Dane rode into the county seat twice. A man in a coat and glasses arrived one morning with a leather case, and the two of them were closeted in the study for most of the day. Things were moving. Slowly, the way things moved out here, with the patience of people who understood that the land didn't hurry, and so nothing else hurried either. On the last day of November, Clara made a full Sunday dinner: roast beef, potatoes, the last of the kitchen garden's carrots, a proper gravy. She wasn't sure why exactly. It was a Sunday, and it felt like the right thing to do, and she'd learned to trust that instinct in the kitchen, if not always in other parts of her life. Dane came downstairs at noon and stopped at the entrance to the dining room, which was set properly. The table laid out, a cloth she'd found in the linen cupboard ironed and straight. "What's the occasion?" he said. "November's over," Clara said. That seemed like reason enough. He looked at the table, then at her. He had, she noticed, made some effort with his appearance, freshly shaved, a clean shirt. This meant something. She couldn't have said exactly what. "Will you eat in here?" she said. "With the men?" A pause. He looked at the table again, at the chair at the head of it that had, as far as she could tell, been empty for the better part of 5 years. "Yes," he said. "I think I will." She went back to the kitchen and finished the gravy and let herself feel, just briefly, something that was close to satisfaction. Not triumph, not pride, just the quiet sense that something was coming back to life. The dinner was loud and good. Hob told a story that was almost certainly not true, and Pete laughed until he choked on his biscuit, and Garrett told a better story with a straighter face that was twice as funny. Dane was quiet, but he was there, seated at his own table, and twice Clara saw the corner of his mouth move in a way that might have been the beginning of a smile. Afterward, when the dishes were done, and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Pete had gone wherever Pete went, Clara was banking the kitchen fire when she heard footsteps. She didn't turn. "Dinner was exceptional," Dane said. "It was just a roast," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't just anything." He paused. She heard him move slightly. "I haven't eaten with the men in... I don't remember how long." "You could do it more often," she said. "If you wanted." A silence. "Maybe," he said, which from Dane Mercer she had learned was more than a maybe. She heard him go. She stood by the stove, hand on the iron, and listened to the house settle around her. The particular sounds of a building full of people doing ordinary things, breathing and sleeping and being warm. The particular quality of a house that was not, for the moment, empty. She had nowhere else to go. That was still true, but she was starting to think that might not be the only thing that was true. She turned off the lamp and went to bed, and outside the first snow of winter began to fall softly on Black Ridge Ranch, covering the frozen ground in white, quiet, and certain. The snow that had started falling on the last night of November didn't stop until the second day of December, and by the time it was done there were 14 inches on the flat, and the fence posts along the north pasture had disappeared to their crossbars. Clara stood at the kitchen window in the early dark of that first real winter morning and looked at the world the snow had made. Everything smoothed and simplified, the jagged edges of the ranch's neglect temporarily buried under something clean, and felt the particular complicated feeling of being somewhere that was not yet home, but was becoming something. She put more wood on the fire and started the coffee. The Warren Colby matter had not resolved itself cleanly, because these things never did. What Clara had gathered, in the way she gathered most information at Black Ridge, through careful listening and the occasional direct question to Garrett, was that Colby had been skimming from the ranch's northern grazing leases for somewhere between 3 and 5 years, filing adjusted reports with the county land office that showed lower cattle numbers than were actually running on the leased land, pocketing the difference in fees. It was not a spectacular theft. It was the quiet, patient kind, the kind that required proximity and trust, and a man too consumed by other things to look closely at his own books. Dane had trusted him completely. That was the part that had done something to his expression in the days following. Not rage, which Clara might have understood, but a kind of flat, exhausted look she recognized from her own experience of discovering that someone you'd believed in had quietly been something else entirely. The lawyer from the county seat had come back twice. There would be a proceeding of some kind in January. The money would not all be recovered. Some of it would. The land lease adjustments could be reversed, but some of it was simply gone, spent or moved or otherwise made to disappear, and the law was not always faster than a man who'd had years to prepare. Dane had not talked about it with her again, not directly, but he'd started eating dinner with the men more evenings than not, which Garrett had told her was something that hadn't happened since before his wife died, and she counted that for what it was worth. The days shortened to their minimum. The ranch contracted further, work pulling inward toward the buildings and the livestock and the things that needed maintaining through the cold. Clara added soup to the regular rotation, proper soup, the kind that took most of the day and filled the kitchen with steam and smell and the particular comfort of something being tended. And the men had taken to lingering over it in a way they hadn't lingered over anything before. December also brought Pete's birthday, which Clara only discovered because she overheard Hob mention it to Alvaro in a way that suggested it was a thing that had gone unmarked in previous years. She thought about this for most of a morning. Then she made a cake, yellow cake, with a caramel glaze she'd worked out from butter and brown sugar and a small amount of cream she'd been saving, and set it on the table at dinner without announcement. Pete stared at it. "What's that for?" he said. "It's your birthday," Clara said. He looked at the cake, then at her, with an expression that was trying hard to be the kind of expression a 13-year-old boy has when he doesn't particularly care about birthdays. It wasn't working. "How'd you know?" he said. "Hob," she said. Hob held up both hands, including the one with the missing fingers. "She asked me directly," he said. "I'm not a man who can lie to a direct question." Garrett reached over and cut the first piece before Pete had time to make any further effort at indifference, and the moment passed into eating, which was how most moments at Blackridge were best resolved. Clara watched Pete eat his cake from the other end of the table, and she thought about what he'd told her once, that he'd only known Dane after, never before. And she felt something she couldn't name precisely, something between protectiveness and sadness. Dane, at the head of the table, cut his own piece and ate it without ceremony, but he said, without looking up, "Happy birthday, Pete." Pete looked startled, as if the words had come from an unexpected direction. "Thank you, sir," he said. It was a small thing. Clara filed it with the other small things. January arrived with a cold that was not the pleasant cold of the first snowfall, but the serious, working cold of deep winter, the kind that got into the barns and made the horses restless and crept under the house's baseboards no matter how carefully you banked the fires. Clara had been at Blackridge 4 months. She had stopped counting weeks sometime in November and had started counting instead in terms of what she knew. The way the kitchen stove ran hotter on the right side than the left, the sound the front steps made in cold weather versus warm, the particular sequence of noises in the bunkhouse that meant the men were going to bed. She knew the ranch, and more than she'd intended, she knew its owner. Not the version of Dane Mercer she'd arrived to find, the man behind glass, functional but absent. She'd come to understand that version as a kind of armor, put on so long ago it had started to feel like skin. What she saw now, on the occasional evenings when he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee while she cleaned up, or on the mornings when he stopped in the barn doorway to watch her argue with a stuck pump handle, with a look that was almost amused. What she saw now was something underneath the armor. A person who had opinions about things, who got quietly furious about injustice in a way that was almost too controlled, like a fire burning in a very small space, who had a dry, brief way of being funny that most people probably missed because they weren't paying attention. She was paying attention. She told herself this was natural. She was perceptive by inclination, and there was little else to occupy her mind in the evenings. She told herself this, and mostly believed it. The legal proceeding regarding Warren Colby happened on a Wednesday in the middle of January. Dane rode into town the night before and came back the following evening, after dark, and went directly to his study. Clara left a plate on the small side table. She didn't knock, just set it there, and came back an hour later to find it empty. And she didn't ask anything. The next morning he came down to breakfast while the men were still eating, which was unusual enough that the table went slightly quiet. He poured his own coffee and sat at the end of the bench rather than at the head of the table, which was also unusual, and he said, without particular drama, "Colby pleaded to the charges. The court's imposed a judgment. We'll see how much of it's recoverable." Garrett said, "Outcome better or worse than you expected?" "About what I expected," Dane said. "Well," Garrett said, "good then." It was not technically good. A judgment imposed was not money recovered, and the whole business had left a gap in the ranch's accounts that would take time to close. But the men seemed to understand that good in this context meant finished, meant the thing was done, and they could stop waiting for it to be. And that was worth something. After breakfast, when the men had gone out to work, Dane stayed at the table with his coffee. Clara was at the stove. She wasn't watching him, but she was aware of him in the particular way she was always aware of him when he stayed somewhere he didn't usually stay. "He told the court he started it the winter after Eleanor died," Dane said. Clara didn't turn. She kept her hands on what she was doing. "He said I wasn't paying attention." A pause. "He was right. I wasn't." "Being right about an opportunity doesn't make it right to take it," Clara said. "No." Dane was quiet. "But I'd rather be honest about what made it possible." She turned then, because there was something in his voice that she hadn't heard before. Not quite self-pity, not quite acceptance. Something between the two, still working itself out. "You were grieving," she said. "I was gone," he said. "Not..." He made a short gesture that meant not literally, but gone. Garrett was running the ranch. Pete was raising himself mostly. He looked at his hands on the table. "I was going through the motions, doing what the day required and nothing more." Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She came to the table and sat across from him, not because she'd decided to, but because her body had moved her there before she could think about whether it was appropriate. "When did it change?" she said. "Or start to?" He looked at her. "The cake," he said, which was not what she'd expected. "For Pete. The birthday cake." He looked away, back at his hands. "I don't know why that particular thing, but I saw his face when he looked at it, and I thought, I've been here this whole time, and I never once thought to do that, and I didn't know how to feel about that." Clara said nothing. "Ashamed, mostly," Dane said. "Pete doesn't hold it against you," Clara said. "He told me you gave him your boots." "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not the same thing. But it means you were seeing him, a little, even when you couldn't do much about it." He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen was warm and the snow was coming again outside the window, small soft flakes that moved sideways in a light wind. "You're very direct," he said finally. "I don't know another way to be," Clara said. "I've tried. It doesn't suit me." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but real. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it does." He stood, picked up his cup, stood there for a moment as if there was something else he was going to say. Then he seemed to decide against it and carried his cup to the basin and went out. Clara sat at the table for another minute and thought about nothing in particular, which was what she always did when she was actually thinking very hard. February at Blackridge was the month she came to understand why the previous cooks had left. It was not the cold, though the cold was real. It was not the isolation, though there were days when the ranch felt like the only thing on earth, everything beyond it muffled under white. It was something harder to name, the particular weight of a place that carried grief in its walls the way old wood carries water, deep and invisible, until something pushed on it. The house was warm and the kitchen was busy, and the men were decent company. But there were hours, usually in the afternoon when the light went flat and gray, and the work had slowed to its minimum, when Blackridge felt like holding your breath. Clara's remedy was to keep moving. She had started, in late January, a reorganization of the storage rooms off the kitchen. Years of accumulated ranch equipment, canning supplies, broken tools, clothing that belonged to no one currently on the ranch. She worked through it systematically, salvaging what was useful and setting aside what wasn't, and the work was not interesting, but it occupied her hands, and she had found long ago that occupied hands helped her mind stay steady. She found the boxes on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked behind a broken buckboard wheel in the back corner of the large storage room. There were 3 of them, wooden crates, sealed with the careful attention of someone who intended them to be closed for a long time. She almost moved them without opening them. Then she read the writing on the side of the top crate. EM, personal, and she stopped. She sat back on her heels and looked at the boxes for a long moment. EM Eleanor Mercer. She thought about the vanity brush upstairs with the pale hairs, the gloves on the nightstand, the quilt. She closed the storage room door and went back to the kitchen and made herself a cup of tea and thought about what she'd found and what, if anything, she should do about it. That evening, after dinner, when most of the men had gone, and Pete was at the kitchen table murdering a perfectly innocent piece of pine with his whittling knife, she asked him, in a voice that was as neutral as she could make it, "Do you know what's in the storage room in the back? The large wooden crates?" Pete's hand stopped. He looked at the wood, not at her. "That's Mrs. Mercer's things," he said. "Her clothes and books and things. He put them away after." He paused. "Garrett told me once they were supposed to go to her sister. She has a sister in Oregon, but he never—" Pete went back to the knife in the wood, a little too focused. "He never sent them." Clara nodded and said nothing more about it. She lay awake that night longer than usual, not with any particular plan, but with the knowledge sitting in her chest that sometimes the things we put away to protect ourselves from become the things that keep us from everything else. March came in loud, the way March in Montana came. Wind and the aggressive, muddy thaw of snow that had been on the ground since November. The road to the county seat turned to soup. The north pasture flooded, as she'd known it would. A fence line went down in the southeast corner, and 3 days were spent in the cold mud repairing it, Dane working alongside the men instead of directing from a distance, which Garrett told her privately was something he'd started doing again only in the last month or so. "Used to work that way," Garrett said. He was having coffee at the kitchen table while she made bread. "When he first built this place. When Eleanor was alive." He cupped his mug with both hands. "Then for a long time he just managed. From up here mostly." A pause. "He's coming back to himself, slowly." "Yes," Clara said. She was watching the dough. "You've had something to do with that," Garrett said. "I cook and keep the house," Clara said. Garrett looked at her over his coffee in the particular way that said he knew she was deflecting and was not interested in it. "You feed people and pay attention to them," he said, "which in this place is more or less the same as medicine." She didn't say anything because she didn't have an answer to that, or not one she was prepared to give. The thing she was not allowing herself to think about directly had been growing in her peripheral vision for weeks. It was not a decision she was making. It was something that was simply happening, the way water finds the lowest point without deciding to. She noticed when he laughed. Brief, low, always surprised sounding, as if he'd forgotten he could. She noticed when he was tired and when he was not. She noticed that he had started, in the last few weeks, finding small reasons to be in the kitchen at hours when he had no particular reason to be there. This she was careful about, because she understood his grief well enough by now to know that loneliness and love were not the same thing, and a woman who confused the two would be doing both herself and him a disservice. He was emerging from something long and terrible. Reaching toward warmth was natural. It did not mean what she might want it to mean, and she was too practical and too proud to mistake gratitude for something deeper. So she kept her hands busy and her voice even, and she paid attention to him and not to herself. And she told herself this was sufficient, and most days she believed it. In the second week of March, she found him in the barn at an hour when he shouldn't have been there. It was near 9 in the evening, and she'd gone to check on one of the mares who'd been slightly off her feed, a habit she'd developed that had started as practicality and become, she admitted, a way of having 5 minutes alone at the end of the day. She pushed open the side barn door and stopped. Dane was standing in front of the mare's stall with a lantern at his feet, and he was talking to the horse in a low voice, and she couldn't hear the words, but the tone of it was something she'd never heard from him before. Unguarded was the word. Like the barn at night was somewhere the armor came off. She almost backed out. Then the mare shifted and looked toward the door, and Dane looked up. They stood there for a moment, each caught. "She off her feet again?" he said, which was the only sensible thing to say. "Checking," Clara said, and came in properly and went to the stall. She ran her hand along the mare's neck. The horse leaned into her slightly. She'd been doing that for weeks, and Clara had come to find it unexpectedly comforting, the simple heaviness of an animal that trusted you. "She'll be fine," Dane said. "She does this when the weather changes. Goes off her feed and then comes back." "I didn't know that. I should have told you." He picked up the lantern, and the light moved across the stall, across the horse's dark eye. "She was Eleanor's horse," he said. "She came with Eleanor." Clara kept her hand on the mare's neck. "She's a good horse." "She is." He was quiet. Then, "Eleanor called her compass, which didn't make sense to me. She said it was because horses always knew where they were going, even when people didn't." A pause. "I think she was saying something about me, and I didn't understand it at the time." Clara turned to look at him. He was looking at the horse, and his face in the lantern light had the quality she'd noticed in the kitchen that January morning. Something working itself out, something that had been held for a very long time beginning, slowly, to move. "She sounds like she was perceptive," Clara said. She was. He said it without the careful blankness he usually brought to anything about Eleanor. She was funny, too. People didn't always know that about her. She had this way of saying the most. She could say something devastating about a situation and make you laugh while she was doing it. He looked at his hands. "I was not an easy person to be married to. I was building the ranch, working constantly. I didn't always see what was right in front of me." "That's a very common thing," Clara said. "It's also a very costly one," he said. She came out of the stall and latched it behind her. They stood in the aisle of the barn with the lantern between them and the sound of the horses breathing around them and the wind outside moving across the Montana dark. "I found the boxes in the storage room," she said, "the ones with her initials. I didn't open them. I thought you should know they were there." He was very still. "Her sister's address," he said after a moment. "I have it somewhere." "There's no hurry," Clara said. "I wanted you to know, in case you'd forgotten they were there." "I hadn't forgotten," he said. He stopped. He started again. "Every winter I think I'll do it in the spring, and every spring I think I'll do it in the summer. And then fall comes and—" He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's not that I can't part with them. It's that doing it means—" He stopped again. "Means something is actually over," Clara said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said. They stood in the barn a moment longer. Then she said, because honesty had always been the only method she trusted, "When you're ready, I'll help you, if you want, or I'll stay out of it entirely, either way." He looked at her for a long moment. The lantern light between them was steady, low, warm. "Thank you, Clara," he said. Not Miss Whitmore, the way he'd addressed her in the first weeks. "Clara, the way you said the name of someone who had become part of your world without you quite noticing the moment it happened." She said goodnight and walked back across the yard toward the house, and she didn't let herself make too much of it, because she was a sensible woman and she had been sensible her entire life, and she saw no reason to stop now. But she walked slowly, and she felt the cold on her face, and the stars over Black Ridge Ranch were enormous and very bright, and she looked up at them for a moment before she went inside. The mare nudged her empty bucket in the stall behind her. Compass, who always knew where she was going. Clara went inside and banked the fire and went to bed, and she lay in the dark for a while, not thinking about anything in particular, which she had learned was what she always did when something had already been decided without her knowing it. Spring arrived the way it did in that part of Montana. Not gently, but argumentatively. Snow one week and mud the next, and then an unreasonably warm afternoon that made everyone briefly optimistic before the temperature dropped again. The calves had started coming, which meant the nights turned long and no one on the ranch was sleeping quite as much as they should have been. Clara had started bringing coffee out to whoever was on night watch because someone had to, and because she slept lightly anyway, and the walks across the dark yard to the barn and back had become a thing she didn't want to stop. April brought the first real warmth. The mud dried. The creek that ran along the south property line ran high and fast with snowmelt, and Clara had taken to walking its bank in the evenings when the kitchen work was done, partly for the air and partly for the particular sound of moving water, which she had missed without knowing it. Dane found her there one evening, or not found exactly. He had evidently been walking the creek line himself to check for damage after a high water week, and she had been standing on the bank watching a piece of bark turn in the current, and they arrived at the same point from opposite directions, and both stopped. "I thought you'd gone in," he said. "Not yet," she said. She thought. He came to stand beside her. Not close, not the careful distance of their early months, but a comfortable distance, the way you stood next to someone you'd stopped measuring space against. The creek turned in front of them. "Your creek is coming down," she said. It was higher Tuesday. "It'll be down to normal by the end of the week," he said. "It does this every April. You should know I sent the boxes to Eleanor's sister," he said, which was not what she'd been expecting. He was looking at the water. "Last week, Garrett took them to the post in town." Clara said nothing. "I wrote a letter," he said, "to the sister. I don't know if it was adequate, but I wrote it." "I'm sure it was more than adequate," Clara said. "You don't know that." "No," she said, "but I know you." He looked at her then, sideways, the last of the afternoon light on his face, and she looked back because she was not a woman who looked away from things. "Clara," he said, and then seemed to lose the thread of what he was going to say. "Yes?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran between them and the far bank. A blackbird made noise somewhere in the willows. "Nothing," he said. He stopped. He looked back at the water. "I'm glad you stayed," he said finally. "I'm aware it's not much to say, but I am." "I'm glad I stayed too," Clara said. It was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. Coming from a man who spent words as carefully as most men spent money. She looked back at the creek, and he stood beside her, and the spring evening settled around Blackridge Ranch with the slow, particular peace of something that had been hard and was, for the moment, less hard. They walked back to the house together, not talking much, and the lights came on in the bunkhouse and the smell of wood smoke was in the air, and the mountains above the valley still had snow on them, but less than before. Clara started supper. Dane sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a ledger he appeared to be reviewing, though she noticed after a while that he hadn't turned a page. She didn't say anything about it. She made supper, and he sat there, and the kitchen was warm, and the evening was quiet, and sometimes that was what a day looked like when it had gone right. She wasn't ready to call it anything more than that, but she also wasn't going to pretend it was nothing. Spring at Blackridge turned out to be a longer project than Clara had expected. The warmth that had arrived in April didn't settle. It came and went, teasing the ground into softening and then pulling back. And the calving season ran 3 weeks longer than Garrett had anticipated because the cows seemed as uncertain about the weather as everyone else. Clara had developed a second skill set by May that she hadn't possessed in September. She could read a sky now with something approaching accuracy. She knew the particular shade of gray that meant snow versus the gray that meant only cold rain. She knew the way the wind shifted when something serious was building in the northwest. She knew the smell of the air before a late frost. She had learned this the way she'd learned everything else at Blackridge, by paying attention to the people who already knew and by making enough mistakes to understand why the right way was right. May gave them 2 weeks of genuine warmth that dried the mud and brought the grass up green and fast, and during those 2 weeks something on the ranch seemed to exhale. The men worked with a different energy, not the grim, determined work of winter, but something lighter, more expansive. Pete had stopped whittling and taken up a fierce interest in a stray dog that had appeared from somewhere in the second week of April and had been sleeping in the barn ever since, despite Garrett's stated objections and demonstrated indifference to removing it. Dane had started walking the property in the evenings, not the purposeful inspection walks he'd always done, checking fences and water sources and the state of the pastures. Something less directed than that. Clara had seen him from the kitchen window several times in the last weeks of April, out past the near corrals, moving along the ridgeline above the south pasture, just walking. Hands in his pockets or behind his back, moving slowly, like a man relearning the dimensions of a place he'd lived in for years. She didn't comment on it to anyone, but she noticed. The evening in the middle of May that changed the tone of things began unremarkably, the way significant evenings often did. She had made pork chops and boiled potatoes, and the first of the spring greens from a kitchen garden that was coming back with an enthusiasm that surprised her. She'd put it to bed in the fall with reasonable expectations, and it had apparently spent the winter plotting. Dinner was loud. Hob had a new story, longer and less plausible than his usual ones, that involved a bear, a wagon wheel, and a dispute over a silver pocket watch, and the men were loud in their skepticism, which Hob enjoyed tremendously. Dane was at the head of the table. He'd been eating with the men reliably for 2 months now, and it had stopped being notable to anyone except Clara, who still noted everything. He wasn't loud, that was never going to be his way, but he was present in a manner different from the glass wall presence of the early months. He listened. He occasionally said something that stopped the table briefly, not because it was sharp, but because it was accurate. He had opinions about things, and he'd started expressing them in the limited but definite way of a man who had remembered that having opinions was something he used to do. After dinner, when the men had cleared out and Pete had gone to the barn to check on the dog, Clara was at the basin with the dishes when Dane came back through the kitchen with his hat. "Going out?" she said. "Fence line on the east side," he said. "Garrett thinks there's a section that won't hold through the summer." "It'll be dark in an hour," she said. "I know." He stopped at the door. "There's weather coming. Wanted to look at it before it gets complicated." She turned from the basin. "What kind of weather?" He looked at the window, at the sky beyond it. "The kind you don't want fence lines failing in," he said. He went out. Clara wiped her hands and went to the window and looked at the northwestern sky, which had the particular layered quality she'd come to associate with serious incoming weather. Not a uniform gray, but something stratified, with a greenish undertone at the horizon that she'd learned to distrust. She went back to the dishes. The storm announced itself properly around 11 that night. Clara had been asleep, or nearly, in the light, easily broken way she'd slept since September, always one ear on the house. The first thing she heard was the wind, which arrived not gradually but all at once, as if it had been waiting outside and someone opened a door. She was at her window before she was fully awake, looking at the dark. The dark was moving. She could see it in the way the trees along the creek line bent and recovered, and in the way the clouds were moving across the moon, fast, too fast, in the way that meant the system was massive and had real energy behind it. Lightning hit somewhere to the north, and the thunder that followed was not the distant rumble of a summer storm, but a concussion, close and percussive, the kind that moved through your chest. She was dressed and had her boots on before the second one. Downstairs, she found Garrett already in the kitchen, pulling on his coat, and Hob behind him, and Alvaro and Diego coming through the back door from the bunkhouse. "The cattle?" Clara said. "Cale and Roy are already out," Garrett said. He was moving with the particular controlled speed of a man who'd handled bad nights before. "We'll push them to the east pasture if we can. It's more sheltered. Main worry is the sound that interrupted him was not thunder. It was something structural, a crack from somewhere outside that was unmistakably something breaking, something large. And Garrett's face changed. "Barn," he said, and they all went. The barn's east-facing side had taken the worst of the first sustained gust, and a section of the upper wall had given way at the seam. Old timber, and Clara had noticed in March that the caulking between the planks had gotten thin, a thing she'd mentioned to Pete and then forgotten to mention to anyone else. She felt this failure keenly now. The horses in the nearest stalls were distressed, pulling at their ties, whites showing around their eyes in the lantern light. "Get Compass first," Clara said, because she knew which horse in that barn was most important. "She's the calmer one," Garrett said, which was not agreement but also not disagreement, and Clara went. The mare was frightened but not frantic. She had more years and more sense than the younger horses, and she let Clara get a hand on her halter and talk to her, low and close and deliberate, while around them the barn filled with voices and movement, and the storm outside made itself progressively louder. She got Compass to the back stall, away from the damaged wall, and latched her in and went back for the next horse. It took 40 minutes to secure the animals. By the end of it, Clara was soaked. The storm had gotten inside through the broken wall section, and the rain was driving horizontal in the gusts, and there was no such thing as dry anymore. Lightning was constant now, irregular flashes that strobed the chaos into still moments. Hob with a terrified gelding, Alvaro on a rafter replacing a broken cross brace with a speed that seemed impossible given the conditions. Pete somewhere she couldn't see calling out that one of the herd had gotten through the south fence. "Where's Mr. Mercer?" Clara said to Garrett when he came by her. Garrett's face did something she didn't fully read. "He went out to the east fence line before it hit," he said. "He should have come back by now." She felt something cold that was not the rain. "How long ago did you last see him?" she said. "Before 9, Garrett said. He was already turning, looking toward the darkness outside the barn. "I'll send Cale." "Cale's with the cattle," Clara said. "I'll go." "Miss Whitmore." "I know the east fence line," she said. I've walked it twice with Garrett in the last month. Give me a lantern that won't go out." He looked at her for one moment. Then he gave her the storm lantern. The east fence line was half a mile from the barn, across the near pasture, and through the gate at the creek crossing. In good conditions, 10 minutes on foot. In this, the wind was pushing so hard that moving into it required leaning at an angle that felt ridiculous, like something from a dream, and the rain was cold enough that by the time Clara reached the gate, her hands had gone stiff, and the lantern was the only reason she could see anything at all. She almost missed him. He was not at the fence line. He was 30 yards short of it, on the ground near the base of the old cottonwood that marked the corner of the east pasture, and she nearly walked past him because her lantern caught him only at the last moment, a dark shape in the grass that the wind and the rain had not quite managed to look like a man lying still. Dane. She was at him before she'd decided to run. He was on his side, and she got the lantern down and got her hands on him, and he moved. Thank whatever luck there was, he moved, and made a sound that was more air than word. "What happened?" she said, and it was not a question, it was just words to fill the space while she ran her hands over him fast and imperfect, trying to find what was wrong. "Horse," he said. His voice was wrong, flattened, the way voices got when pain was using up most of a person's resources. "You were thrown?" Spooked at the lightning. He tried to push himself up and she put a hand on his chest. "Don't," she said. "I have to. The fence will wait," she said. "Tell me where you're hurt." He was quiet for a moment that seemed to cost him something. "Shoulder," he said. "Right. And my ribs, maybe. It's hard to tell." She got the lantern positioned to give her light, and she looked at his right shoulder. Even through his coat, she could see the wrong shape of it, the drop, the forward set of the joint. She'd seen a dislocated shoulder once before, on a farmhand outside Billings, and she recognized it the way you recognized a word in a language you'd only half learned. "We need to get you inside," she said. "I know," he said. He was trying to sound like himself, like the man who managed from a position of control, and he wasn't quite succeeding. I'm going to need help getting up." She got him up on the second try. Mostly, he was heavier than she'd expected, or she was less strong than she'd hoped, and the wind was not helping. He got his legs under him, and she got under his good arm, and they stood in the rain in the dark with the storm around them, and for a moment neither of them moved, just stabilized. "All right?" she said. "Fine," he said, which was clearly not accurate, but was what he was going to say. They walked back to the house. It took longer than 30 yards should have taken. Twice the wind gusted hard enough to make forward progress essentially theoretical, and she felt him absorb the second one with a sound he tried to swallow and didn't quite. His right arm was braced against his chest with his left hand, the way you held something that couldn't swing free. She got him through the back door and into the kitchen and into the chair, and he sat in it with the look of a man who had just finished arguing with his own body and lost. She started with his coat. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "Just be still." Getting the coat off the bad shoulder required a kind of specific patience she didn't know she had. She worked the left side off first, then eased the right, and each movement made him still in a way that meant it hurt more than he was saying. When she had the coat off, she could see the shoulder clearly, the joint sitting too far forward and too low, the shape of it undeniably wrong. She stood in front of him and looked at it and did her arithmetic. "When did this happen?" she said. "I don't know. After 9, before the worst of it hit." He looked at his shoulder with the evaluating expression of someone assessing damage to something they didn't want to think about too directly. "Have you—" He stopped. "I've seen one before," she said. "I didn't fix it, though. Someone else did." She was being honest because she thought he deserved honesty about what was going to happen next. He looked at her steadily. "Can you do it?" he said. "I think so," she said. "It's going to hurt considerably." "More than it hurts now?" "For a few seconds," she said, "then probably less." He nodded once. "All right." She pulled the second kitchen chair in front of his and sat, and she talked him through what she was going to do in the same low, direct voice she'd used on Compass in the barn. Not because she thought he was like a frightened horse, but because something about the situation had stripped them both down to the simplest possible version of communicating, and the simplest version was the clearest. She got his right arm extended and his elbow at 90 degrees, and she held his forearm in both her hands. "Breathe out," she said. He did. She rotated his arm outward and upward in the slow, firm arc that she'd watched a man do once in a barn outside Billings, and she felt the joint resist, and then, with a sensation she would not soon forget, give and relocate with a sound that was small and definite and terrible. Dane made a sound, not a word, something more involuntary than that, and then his breathing changed. The tight, managed quality of it released into something deeper, and she knew it had gone back. "Done," she said. He sat for a moment with his eyes closed. She kept her hands on his arm until she was sure he was all right, and she was aware that his hand had closed around her wrist at some point during it, and that he was still holding on, not hard, just holding. "Thank you," he said when he could. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We need to strap it." She got strips of cloth from the linen cupboard and came back and bound his right arm against his chest. Not tightly, but enough to keep the joint from taking weight or swinging free while the damaged tissue did whatever it was going to do. He let her do it without comment, which she took to mean the pain had settled into something manageable. While she worked, she said practically, "Your ribs. Can you breathe normally?" He demonstrated. "Breathe deeper." He did, and his face tightened but didn't break. "Sharp," he said. I've had broken ribs before. It doesn't feel the same." "Bruised, probably," she said, "but you'll need a doctor to look at them." "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. She finished the binding and sat back. Outside, the storm was still going. Rain on the windows, wind against the west wall of the house, a distant roll of thunder that meant the worst of it was passing east. Inside, the kitchen fire had burned low while she was out, and the lamp on the table was the main light, and they were both soaked, and she hadn't yet thought about that. She got up and added wood to the fire. She put water on for something hot. She moved through the kitchen with the steady, unsentimental efficiency of a woman whose hands had a task and were grateful for it. "You came out in the storm," Dane said. He was watching her from the chair, his bound arm against his chest. "You didn't come back," she said. Garrett had his hands full," she said, "and I knew where the east fence line was." He was quiet. She felt his eyes on her back while she worked, the particular weight of being watched by someone who has seen you clearly. "Clara," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the assessing look, not the grateful look, not the careful managed look of a man maintaining appropriate distance. Something without management in it. Something that had gotten through whatever he usually kept in place. Possibly because pain and cold and 2.5 hours in a storm had dismantled the architecture of his usual self-containment. "I need to say something to you," he said. "You don't have to say anything tonight," she said. "You're hurt and you're cold and—" "I know," he said. "But if I don't say it now, I'm going to put it away again, and I've been putting things away too long." He stopped. His jaw moved, not with pain, but with the effort of someone finding words for something they'd been carrying without words. I'm not good at this," he said. "I haven't been close to anyone in a long time. By choice, mostly, because it's—" He stopped again. She came back to the table and sat across from him because standing over him while he said something difficult seemed wrong. "Because losing someone is terrible," she said. "Yes," he said. "And I decided I'd rather not have to go through that again," which seemed reasonable. For a long time it seemed like the only reasonable thing. His eyes were on the table, then came up to her face. "And then you came here, and you didn't do anything particular. You were here. You were here every day, and you paid attention, and you—" He seemed to run out of the sentence. "And I've been trying not to notice for months," he said, with a bluntness that was clearly not planned, "and it has not been working. Clara did not say anything immediately, because she was a person who thought before she spoke when speaking mattered, and this mattered. "I know what you're afraid of," she said. "Yes," he said. "I expect you do. I'm not going to tell you it's an unreasonable fear," she said. "You lost something it broke you. That's real. I'm not going to pretend losing people isn't terrible, because it is, and I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "But you've been deciding in advance what's going to happen, and that's not knowing the future, that's just suffering it before it comes. Maybe instead of it coming at all. He was very still. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I'm not saying this so that you have to do something about it. I'm saying it because you were honest with me, and you deserve the same back. She put her hands flat on the table because she needed somewhere to put them. I notice you too, she said. I have for a while. I've been being careful about it because I wasn't sure what it was, and I wasn't sure. She stopped. I didn't want to mistake something for something it wasn't. The fire had come up and was giving the kitchen its warmth back. The storm outside had quieted to rain, steady and ordinary. The lamp between them burned small and even. And now? He said. And now I'm less uncertain, she said. He reached across the table with his left hand, his good hand, and set it on top of hers. He didn't say anything. She turned her hand over and he held it, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen with the rain on the windows and the fire behind her, and neither of them needing to say anything more right then. After a while, she made him drink something hot, and she checked the binding on his shoulder and sent him upstairs with instructions that were not really negotiable, and he went, which meant he was either more tired than he appeared or he'd decided that following her instructions was something he was willing to do. She sat in the kitchen alone for a while after. The storm had moved east, and the wind had dropped to something navigable, and through the window she could see, not stars yet, but the particular quality of cloud that meant they might come. She thought about what he'd said and what she'd said, and she turned it over carefully, the way she turned over anything important, looking for the places where it was weak or wrong. She didn't find many. She was scared in the particular way she was scared of things that mattered, not the bright, sharp fear of immediate danger, but the slower, deeper one, the kind that meant she cared about the outcome. She'd been scared like this exactly twice before. Once when her mother was sick, and once when her father's debts began to surface and she understood what it meant for her life. Both times she'd been afraid, and both times she'd kept moving forward because she was not a person who could tolerate standing still when there was something to be done. She put out the lamp and banked the fire and went to bed. And the rain came down on Black Ridge Ranch soft and steady, and in the morning everything would need to be assessed and repaired and accounted for. But tonight something had cracked open that she did not think would close again, and she lay in her room listening to the rain, and she did not try to close it. The morning after a storm was always a particular kind of ugly. Clara was up before 4 and out in the yard with a lantern by 4:30, taking stock. The barn wall needed serious repair. She could see that in the early gray light, the split timber gaping where the wind had gotten in. 3 sections of fence were down, visible from the house. The kitchen garden, which had been thriving, had been flattened by the wind and the rain. The young plants pressed into the mud in ways that were difficult to evaluate in the dark. Garrett was already at the barn when she got there, and Hob was pulling damaged timber, and Alvaro had the horses out in the smaller corral so that the wall could be accessed properly. Everything was muddy. Everything would need to be done in the particular order that made sense for the damage, and that order was going to take most of the day to establish. "Mr. Mercer?" Garrett said when she came in. "Sleeping," she said. "Dislocated shoulder, possibly bruised ribs. He needs to rest it and have a doctor look at him today." Garrett absorbed this with the stillness of a man who dealt with information by processing it internally before letting it show. "I'll send Pete to town for Dr. Harmon," he said. "Good," she said. She went back to the house and started breakfast, because the men were going to need it, and because starting breakfast was what she did, and she was at the stove when she heard the stairs and looked up. Dane was standing in the kitchen doorway, dressed, which she had told him not to be. He looked like a man who'd slept 3 hours after having a very hard day, which was accurate. "I told you to rest," she said. "I rested," he said. "Yup. Now I'm getting up." "Your shoulder is bound." "I'm not an invalid, Clara." He said her name with the ease of someone who'd been saying it in private for some time and had recently given himself permission to say it out loud. He came to the table and sat, and she poured him coffee, and he took it. She looked at him. "Pete's going for the doctor," she said. "I know, Garrett told me." He looked out the window at the yard, at the damaged barn, at the flattened kitchen garden visible beyond it. "How bad?" "Bad enough," she said. "Not catastrophic. The barn wall and 3 fence sections, that I can see. The garden needs assessment." She turned back to the stove. "You should have come back before it hit." "Yes," he said. "I know." "The horse, she came back herself," he said. She was in the east pasture when Cale found the herd this morning. She's all right. Clara let out a breath she hadn't been holding consciously. They were quiet while she finished breakfast. Outside, the men were beginning to make the purposeful noise of people starting to put something back together. The sun was coming up behind the clouds, the light thin and gray and working. It was going to be a long day. She set his breakfast in front of him and he looked up at her, and for a moment the kitchen was very ordinary, and also not ordinary at all. "Last night," he said. "Last night," she said. She sat down across from him with her own coffee. "I meant what I said," he said, in case the pain made it seem otherwise. "I know you did," she said. "So did I." He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled. "Good," he said. She almost laughed. Not unkindly, just at the particular plainness of him, the way he handled even the significant things with the same economical directness he handled everything else. She didn't laugh, but something in her face showed it, and he saw it, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way it sometimes did. "Eat," she said. "The doctor's coming, and you're going to need your strength for the argument about whether you need to rest." "I don't need—" "You do," she said. He ate. Outside, Black Ridge Ranch began the work of recovering from the night, the way it had always recovered from hard things. Not quickly, not smoothly, with plenty of mud and effort, and the occasional wrong decision, but steadily, and with everyone doing their part. The sun was going to come out by noon. Clara could feel it in the quality of the air, the way the clouds had thinned on the eastern edge. It would come out, and the mud would begin to dry, and the fence would be repaired, and the barn wall would be rebuilt better than before. The morning was cold and the coffee was hot, and across the table from her sat a man who had said an honest thing when he could have kept quiet, and who was eating his breakfast with the careful attention of someone who had decided that ordinary mornings were worth being present for. That was, Clara thought, the whole of it. That was all of it. It was enough. Dr. Harmon arrived before noon and spent 20 minutes with Dane in the study, which Dane had apparently decided was a more appropriate setting for medical examination than his bedroom, a choice that Dr. Harmon accepted with the patience of a man who had been doctoring ranch owners for 30 years and had long since stopped trying to impose logic on their preferences. Clara was in the kitchen when the doctor came through afterward, washing his hands at the basin with the careful thoroughness of his profession. "2 bruised ribs," he said, without being asked. "Nothing broken. The shoulder, whoever put that back did it right. Another hour and the muscle spasm would have made it significantly more difficult." "Is there anything he shouldn't do?" Clara said. Dr. Harmon looked at her over his spectacles with an expression that said he'd treated enough men like Dane Mercer to know the answer to that question was largely theoretical. "He shouldn't lift anything heavier than a coffee cup for 3 weeks," he said. "He shouldn't ride. He should rest that shoulder as much as he'll actually agree to rest it, which I expect is considerably less than what's medically advisable." He dried his hands. "Keep the binding firm. If he develops fever or the pain in his ribs gets significantly worse, send for me immediately. But I will," Clara said. "Good." He took his bag. He paused at the door, looked at her in the direct, unhurried way of someone making a professional assessment. "You've been here since September." "Yes." "Garrett said you relocated the shoulder yourself." "I did." He nodded once. "Well done," he said, in a tone that indicated he did not say this casually, and left. Clara stood in the kitchen for a moment after she heard the front door close. Then she went to the stove and started lunch, because the men had been working since before dawn, and the barn wall was still only half repaired, and everyone was going to need to eat. The recovery from the storm took 8 days. Not 8 easy days, 8 days of the particular combination of hard physical work and logistical problem-solving that Black Ridge seemed to specialize in, the kind of work that required the whole ranch to function as a unit and left everyone tired in a way that was honest and therefore bearable. The barn wall was rebuilt with better timber than had come down, because Dane had been emphatic about this from his position of enforced partial rest, directing Garrett from the doorway of the barn with his arm bound and his expression making clear that he found the directorial role considerably less satisfying than actual work. Clara fed everyone extra. She didn't discuss this as a policy. She simply cooked more, kept the coffee pot full at all hours, started leaving bread and cold meat on the side table in the kitchen so that whoever came in at odd hours could eat without waiting. By the fourth day, she noticed that Pete had started appearing at 7 in the evening specifically for the bread and cold meat, which suggested that this was now an understood institution, which was fine. She had always found it easier to express things through practical action than through declaration. Dane's shoulder was the problem that wanted to be more of a problem than he would allow it to be. He was not, as Dr. Harmon had predicted, a good patient in the traditional sense. He could not fully stop working because the ranch required management decisions even when the physical work was delegated, and so he was everywhere except where the lifting happened, talking to Garrett in the barn, reviewing ledger entries at the kitchen table with his good hand, riding Compass at a walk to assess the fence repairs, which was not precisely what the doctor had meant by no writing, but was close enough to the letter of it that Clara chose not to argue. What she did instead was make sure he ate properly and slept enough, which she accomplished not through direct instruction. She'd learned quickly that direct instruction from her landed differently than from a doctor, and sometimes needed to come sideways, but through the positioning of food and the strategic timing of when she mentioned things. She left his supper later than the men's so that he'd still be at it when he came in from the evening's last round. She made things that were easy to eat left-handed. She said goodnight at 9:30, which she had found was a useful signal. He noticed this. She knew he did because on the fifth evening he said, with the particular dry brevity she'd come to love, "You're managing me." "I'm being attentive," she said. "Those aren't different things." "Tonight they are," she said. "Eat your supper." He ate his supper, and the corner of his mouth moved, and she went back to the kitchen and permitted herself to feel, briefly, something warm and ordinary and good. What had shifted between them after the storm was real, and they both knew it was real, but the shape of it was still being determined, carefully, and with the particular caution of two people who had both learned that moving too fast toward something you wanted was a reliable way to break it. They were not demonstrative. Neither of them had a demonstrative nature, and the ranch was not a private place in the way that houses in town were private. There were 7 men who lived and worked in close proximity, and Pete, who noticed everything and had an opinion about most of it. Public declarations would have felt wrong to both of them, not because they were ashamed of anything, but because what was between them was theirs and did not require an audience. What changed was the quality of the ordinary things. He came to the kitchen in the evenings and they talked about the ranch, about the men, about things he was reading or things she'd noticed in the accounts or things that were happening in the county that Garrett brought back from his trips to town. They had always talked in this kitchen. They had been talking more as the months passed. What changed was the ease of it, the absence of the careful management she'd felt in him before, the watching from behind glass quality that had sometimes made the conversations feel like they were happening through a medium. He was present now, in a way he hadn't been. It was the only way she knew how to describe it. One evening in the 3rd week of May, she was mending a shirt at the kitchen table, Pete's, which had sustained significant damage during the storm recovery in ways that Pete had declined to explain. And Dane was across the table with his coffee and a copy of a surveying report for the northwest section of the property. They had been sitting there for perhaps 40 minutes in the comfortable silence of people who had gotten past needing to fill every moment with noise, when he said, without looking up from his report, "I want to show you something, tomorrow, if you're willing." "What sort of something?" she said. "Something I haven't shown anyone," he said, "in a while." She looked at him. He was still looking at the report, but there was something careful in his stillness. "All right," she said. He came to the kitchen door the next morning at 8, which was later than the men had gone out, but earlier than she'd expected. He had a horse saddled, Compass, the mare who always knew where she was going, and when Clara came to the door, he said, "There's a second horse if you want one, or you can ride double. It's only about a mile." "I'll ride with you," she said, which was the honest answer, and she saw something in his face acknowledge it. She'd ridden before, not extensively, but enough to manage, and Compass was a sensible horse who didn't make opinions out of carrying 2 people. They went out through the east gate and up along the ridgeline. Clara had seen him walk alone in April, and the morning was good, clear and just warm enough. The grass fully green now, the mountains showing clean-edged against a sky that had settled into real summer blue. He didn't say much as they rode. She didn't ask. The place was about a mile up the ridge, where a stand of old cottonwoods grew around a natural depression in the land that collected water from the hill above it. A small, quiet pool, very still, with the cottonwoods around it giving it the feel of something set apart from the rest of the ranch. Not hidden exactly, but private by virtue of the topography. There was a marker under the largest cottonwood. Simple stone, not quarried, just found. A flat piece of rock set upright in the ground, with 2 names on it. Eleanor Ann Mercer. And beneath it, smaller, James. Just the one name. Clara got down from behind him and stood in front of the marker. The pool was very still beside her, reflecting the cottonwoods and the sky above them. Dane stood a few feet back. He had his hat in his hands. "I put this here the summer after," he said. "Garrett helped me carry the stone up." He paused. "There's a proper grave in town, in the cemetery. This was for me, to have somewhere on the property." "It's right that it's here," Clara said. She meant it, and she said it simply because it was simple. He came to stand beside her. They were quiet for a while. A bird was moving in the cottonwoods above them, something small and unseen, making periodic announcements about its location. "She would have liked you," he said. Clara looked at him. "She didn't have a lot of patience for performance," he said. "She liked people who were straightforward. She would have liked that you say what you actually think." He looked at the marker. "She used to tell me I was too guarded. She said I spent so much energy managing how things looked that I forgot to feel them." A pause. "She was right. I've had a long time to understand how right she was." "You feel things," Clara said. "You just keep them very quiet." "Yes," he said. "Possibly too quiet." She looked at the stone. James. A name given to someone who had never had the chance to grow into it. She thought about what it meant to carry that, not just Eleanor, but James, the version of the future that had been taken away. "I'm sorry," she said. Not the social sorry, not the automatic condolence, the real one. "I know," he said. They stood for a while longer, and it was not sad in the way she'd expected. It was something else, something that had sadness in it, but also was not only sadness, like being in a place where something difficult had happened, and the difficult thing was real and acknowledged, and did not need to be hidden or hurried past. After a while, he put his hat back on, and she heard him take a breath. "I haven't brought anyone here," he said. "Not since Garrett helped me set the stone." "Why now?" she said. He looked at her, and his face had that quality it sometimes had in the kitchen late in the evenings. The without armor quality. The version of him she was fairly sure most people never saw. "Because you're going to be part of this place," he said. "And I didn't want this to be something you didn't know about." Clara was quiet for a moment. The cottonwoods moved above them, light coming through in shifting pieces. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to actually believe that." She reached over and took his left hand, his good hand, and he led her, and they stood there together under the cottonwoods with the still pool beside them and the Montana morning open above them. And it was not a perfect moment because neither of them was a person who made perfect moments. But it was real, and it was theirs, and that was considerably better. Summer arrived at Black Ridge with an abundance that felt almost excessive after the long winter. Heat and grass and the kind of work that was satisfying rather than desperate, the work of a ranch in its good season. The cattle were healthy. The repaired barn wall held through 2 summer storms with no complaint. The kitchen garden, which Clara had feared was destroyed by the May storm, turned out to have been merely flattened and recovered with a vigor that she found personally gratifying. The recovery, she thought. Things could do that if you gave them time. She and Dane had settled into something that did not have a formal name but did not require one. He had dinner with the men every evening now. He had stopped going to bed at the same time as closing down a machine and started going to bed at the end of an actual evening, which sometimes meant 10 o'clock and sometimes meant midnight, depending on whether there was a conversation worth having. They walked sometimes, in the evenings, along the creek or up toward the ridge, not always talking, sometimes just being out in the same air, which was something she had not known she valued until she'd started doing it. Pete noticed. Pete noticed everything, and he had the discretion of a child who understood more than he was supposed to and had decided that saying so was not in his interest. He was simply, observably, happier, in the inarticulate way of young people who feel the emotional temperature of a household without being able to name what's changed. Bob noticed and made no comment except to start whittling something at the kitchen table. He'd taken it up from Pete, who'd abandoned it, which Clara suspected was his way of finding a reason to be present in the evenings without appearing to have a reason. Garrett noticed and said, one morning when they were alone in the barn office going over the summer accounts, "He's different." "People change," Clara said. "Not usually," Garrett said. "Not men like him. Not after what he went through." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "I've known Dane Mercer for 12 years. I watched him build this ranch, and I watched what the loss of Eleanor did to him, and I watched him—" He stopped. "You don't need to hear my assessment." "Tell me," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I didn't think he'd come back from it," he said. "Not fully. I thought the best we'd get was functional. A man who did the work and kept the lights on, and that was all." He paused. "I was wrong about that." Clara looked at the ledger and said nothing. "I'm glad," Garrett said simply, and went back to the accounts. The hardest conversation happened in July. She hadn't been expecting it to be a hard conversation, which was perhaps why she wasn't properly prepared for it. It started as a practical discussion. They were on the porch in the evening, the summer dark coming down slowly, the kind of long western twilight that seemed to make everything feel both ordinary and significant. And she had said something about the possibility of hiring another hand for the fall roundup, and he had agreed. And then there was a silence, and he said, "I keep thinking about the future." "In what sense?" she said. "In the sense that I have one now," he said, which was not something I was thinking about this time last year. She was quiet because the sentence had weight, and she wanted to give it space. "I was managing," he said. "That was the word for it. Every year I managed. I kept the ranch running. I looked after the men, more or less. He stopped. "I wasn't looking past the immediate season. I wasn't making plans. I was just—" He seemed to search for it. "Maintaining a holding position." "Yes," she said. "I could see that when I came. And now I'm—" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark. "I'm thinking past October. I'm thinking about what the ranch looks like in 5 years. I'm thinking about—" He stopped again, and she had the sense he was approaching something he'd circled several times and kept retreating from. She waited. "I almost didn't advertise for a cook," he said. "What?" "After the last one left. I thought, the men can manage. It's only food." And Garrett said— He made a short sound that might have been a laugh. "Garrett told me I was being an idiot, in considerably more diplomatic terms, and he drafted the advertisement himself and sent it in to the paper." Clara thought about the 4-line advertisement that had been soft along the fold from her reading it so many times. No references required. "I'm glad he did," she said. "So am I." Dane turned to look at her. The last of the evening light was on his face, and he looked, not younger exactly, but lighter, as if something that had been pressing on him from inside had eased. "Clara, I need to ask you something." "All right," she said, and her heart did something it had not done in a long time. Moved, quickly, with the particular combination of hope and fear that meant the thing being approached actually mattered. "I don't want—" He stopped, started again. "What I'm trying to say is not coming out the way I want it to." "Take your time," she said. He looked at her directly. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. Not as—" He made a small, frustrated gesture. "I want you to stay because this is your home, and I want it to be your home, permanently." He said it plainly, finally. "I want to marry you if you'll have me. I know it's not nothing to ask. I know it changes everything you—" "Dane," she said. He stopped. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "You didn't let me finish." "I know what you were going to say," she said. "I've known what you were going to say for about 2 months. I've been waiting for you to get there." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she found so genuinely human in its mix of relief and slight indignation that she felt something loosen in her chest that had been held since September. 2 months, he said. "You take your time with things," she said. "I've learned to appreciate that." "You might have said something," he said. "So might you," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he did something she hadn't seen him do before. Not in 9 months. Not once. Not fully. He laughed. Not the almost smile, not the corner of the mouth acknowledgement of something that might be funny. An actual laugh. Brief and genuine, the sound of someone who had surprised themselves. It lasted only a moment, and it was not graceful or impressive, just a real sound from a real person. And it was the best thing she had ever heard at Black Ridge Ranch. "All right," he said, when he'd recovered himself. "Yes." "Then it's settled." "It's settled," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the way she had taken his under the cottonwoods in May, and they sat on the porch of Black Ridge Ranch in the summer dark and said nothing more for a while, which was exactly the right amount to say. August was the month the ranch came fully back to itself. Clara felt it in the way she could only have felt it after 9 months there. The difference between a place that was surviving and a place that was living. It was in the small things, which were always where the truth lived. It was in the fact that Pete had been given formal responsibilities for the first time, a horse of his own to care for, and was visibly transformed by this in the way that young people are transformed by being genuinely trusted with something real. It was in the fact that Dane had started fixing things around the house. The crooked barn door, the front porch railing that had needed painting since before she arrived, the uneven shelf in the kitchen that had never been fixed and she had been working around for 9 months. He did these things without announcement and without apparent expectation of comment, in the early mornings before the day's work started, and Clara left him to it and found herself moved by the gesture in a way she couldn't entirely explain. It was in the fact that the front porch, which had been empty since she arrived, now had 2 chairs. She hadn't put them there. She came out one morning in the 3rd week of August and found them. Nothing fancy, good solid ranch chairs that had apparently been in the storage room, cleaned up and set out side by side. She stood and looked at them for a moment. That evening, she sat in one, and when Dane came out at the end of the day, he sat in the other without any particular comment, and they watched the sun go down over the Montana hills, and that was how it was from then on. There were hard things still. She would not pretend otherwise. The grief was not gone because grief didn't go. It changed shape, found new places to sit in a person, became part of the furniture of who you were rather than something that overwhelmed the room. She saw it in him sometimes, usually in the fall when the weather turned and the light had a particular quality that she suspected matched the quality of the light the night he lost Eleanor. He went quiet on those days, quieter than his ordinary quiet, and she let him be quiet and made sure there was food at hand and did not demand anything. Once, in the middle of September, she came into the kitchen before dawn and found him at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold, looking at nothing. She didn't ask. She made fresh coffee and set it in front of him and sat across from him and just sat there, not performing anything, not solving anything. After a while, he said, "Anniversary." "I know," she said. They sat until the skies started to lighten, and then he got up and went out to work, and that was the whole of it. She also had her hard things, which was only fair. She had come to Black Ridge with nothing and had built something real, but the nothing she'd come from was still real too. She thought about her father more often than she'd expected, not with anger, which had been her first emotion when the debt surfaced, but with something more complicated. He had loved her, badly and impractically, and she had loved him, and he was gone, and the world he'd left her with was not the world he'd intended. She had made something of it anyway. She thought he'd have been glad about that. She wrote to her cousin Mabel in early August, the first contact she'd had since the spring. She told Mabel she was well, that she had work, that things had changed considerably. She did not yet tell Mabel about Dane, because some things needed to be real in your own mind before you handed them to someone else's. But she sent the letter, and she felt better for having sent it. The question of when and how to have a wedding at a working ranch in the middle of Montana was, it turned out, mostly a logistical question. She and Dane had one conversation about it, in the kitchen, that lasted about 40 minutes and established most of what needed to be established. Neither of them wanted anything large. Neither of them needed ceremony for its own sake. What they wanted was the fact of it, the legal and human reality of being married, being each other's, having that be the acknowledged truth of things. "In town," she said, "at the courthouse. And then we come back here, and I make dinner." He looked at her. "I could arrange something more. I don't want more," she said. "I want the men here. And Pete. And Mrs. Eldon if she'll come. And I want to cook dinner in my own kitchen and eat it at my own table, and that's what I want." He was quiet for a moment. "Your own kitchen," he said. "It has been for 9 months," she said. "Yes," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved. It has. They set a date for the first week of October, when the worst of the fall work would be done and before the weather got serious. Clara wrote to the county courthouse. She wrote again to Mabel, this time with the full truth of it, and got back a letter that was warmer than she'd expected, with a line at the end that made her stand in the kitchen for a moment. I always thought you were the one who knew how to make something out of nothing. I'm glad you found somewhere worth making it. She put the letter in the small box she kept in her room with her few personal things, and she went back to the kitchen and she made dinner. Set. October came cold and clear and beautiful, the way it sometimes came in Montana when the fall decided to show what it was actually capable of. The aspens on the north ridge were gold, and the cottonwoods along the creek were yellow, and the mountains above them had their first snow sitting clean and white against the blue. The morning of the first Wednesday of October, Clara stood in her room and looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand. She was wearing the dress she'd brought from Billings, her best, which was dark blue wool and had been her best since before she came here. She had pressed it the night before and fixed the collar where it had started to fray, and she had done her hair more carefully than usual, and she looked like herself, which was exactly what she'd intended. Pete knocked on her door at 8:30, which was when they'd agreed to leave. She opened the door, and he was standing in the hall in his cleaned-up clothes, with his hair flattened with water in a way that suggested significant effort. And he was holding something, a small bunch of late wildflowers he'd clearly gone out and gathered himself, purple asters, and the last of the goldenrod, tied with a piece of string. He held them out. "Pete," she said. "They're not much," he said, in a voice that was trying to be casual. "I just thought—" She took them and did not say anything for a moment because she needed the moment. "They're perfect," she said. He looked at the floor. "Okay," he said. "Okay. Garrett's ready." She carried the flowers all the way to town. The courthouse was small, and the justice of the peace was a man named Aldridge, who had a magnificent mustache and an air of having married a great many people and having taken each ceremony seriously despite the repetition. The men were there, all 7 of them, in various states of dressed up, Hob having made some effort with his hair that mirrored Pete's. Mrs. Eldon was there, in her good coat, and she held Clara's flowers while the words were said. Dane stood beside her in his dark coat, clean-shaved, and he looked like himself, the real version. The version that had been growing more visible since September and was now simply what he was. He said the words in his quiet, direct way, and when the justice asked if Clara had anything to say, she said yes and meant it. And when it was done, he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in front of all of them in the most direct, unhesitating way she'd ever seen him do anything, which made Hobbs say something in an undertone that made Alvaro laugh. Garrett shook Dane's hand and then, with a formality that she found unexpectedly touching, shook Clara's. "Welcome," he said. "Properly." "Thank you," she said. "Properly." They drove back to Black Ridge in a small caravan, Garrett's wagon and Hobbs and Pete wedged in beside Clara on the seat of the ranch wagon. And the October afternoon light was gold and slanted, and the mountains were above them the whole way home. Black Ridge came into view around the last curve of the road, the house and barns against the sky. And Clara looked at it from the wagon seat with the flowers in her lap and felt something settle in her chest with the quiet finality of something finding where it belonged. She made the dinner she'd planned: roast beef, proper potatoes, 3 pies, and the apple cake she'd been making since her first month, the one that had belonged to Dane's mother and that she had made her own by making it so many times. The kitchen was full and loud and warm, and Dane sat at the head of his table with a glass of cider and a look on his face that was not triumphant or dramatic, but was simply, deeply right. Pete ate 2 pieces of pie. After the men had gone and the kitchen was quiet and the dishes were done, Clara stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark yard and the barns and the mountains beyond. She could hear Dane moving in the study down the hall, papers, the familiar sounds of his end-of-day routine. She thought about the 4-line advertisement, the train through the tall grass and the mountains, the boy on the wagon seat asking about biscuits, the eviction notice and the bank clerk and the ceramic rooster and all the things she'd arrived carrying that now felt like things that had happened to someone she used to be. She was 25 years old. She was standing in her own kitchen in Montana. The man in the study down the hall was her husband, which was still a sentence that required a beat to land. She was not done being afraid of things. She'd never been that kind of person. the kind who stopped being afraid. But she had learned, and was still learning, that the things worth doing were almost always the things that scared you, and that the only real alternative to being afraid was to be nowhere. She turned off the lamp and went down the hall. The first weeks of marriage were not what Clara had expected, which she supposed was how most things worth having announced themselves. By being different from what you'd imagined, neither better nor worse in the ways you'd predicted, just realer, more specific, more daily. She had expected some period of adjustment, some awkwardness in the renegotiation of the space between them now that the space had changed. What she found instead was that the daily life of Blackridge continued in most of its particulars exactly as it had for the past year, and that this was not a disappointment, but a revelation. The marriage had not transformed them into different people or the ranch into a different place. It had simply made true what had already been true for months, that they were each other's, that this was home, that the life being lived here was being lived together rather than alongside. He still came to the kitchen in the evenings. She still noted the particular quality of his silences. Pete still appeared with suspicious regularity around dinner and stayed longer than he had any practical reason to. Garrett still ran the ranch with the quiet authority of a man who had been doing it since before Dane could look at it directly, and the men still ate with the concentration of people who were grateful for food that was worth the concentration. What changed was smaller and more specific than she'd thought to anticipate. He said her name differently, not dramatically differently, just with the ease of someone who had stopped editing themselves before they spoke. She found his jacket on the hook beside hers and felt something so ordinary and so good that she stood in the hallway for a moment just to let herself feel it. They had a habit now, in the evenings on the porch, of sitting in their two chairs and watching whatever the sky was doing, and they spoke or didn't speak in the way of people who had gotten past needing performance from each other. These were small things. She had learned, over the past year, that small things were almost always the real things, and that the large dramatic ones, the storm, the shoulder, the confrontation with Warren Colby in the front room, were only the moments when the small, real things became visible. November brought the second winter Clara spent at Blackridge, and she discovered that knowing what a Montana winter was did not make it less, but it did make it different. She knew now what to lay in, how much wood, how far ahead to plan the provisions. She knew that the third week of November was when everyone got tired, when the novelty of the first snow had worn off, and the end of it was not yet imaginable, and she planned accordingly. Heartier food, the occasional luxury she could manage from what the supply wagon brought from town, the birthday cake for Pete, which was now an established institution that he pretended not to look forward to and counted down to from 2 weeks out. She knew the sound of the house in wind and in snow and in the absolute cold, clear nights when the temperature dropped so far that everything outside went silent, as if the world had decided to stop and wait. She knew which floorboard outside the bedroom door announced itself at night. She knew the way the kitchen stove needed to be managed on the coldest mornings. Drafted first, then loaded, never the other way. And she knew that Garrett drank his coffee black in winter and with sugar in summer, and that Roy was afraid of the dark in a way he would never have admitted, but that was evident from the care he took to always be back in the bunkhouse before the last lamp went out. This kind of knowing, the specific, granular, daily kind, was what she had been building for a year, and she felt the weight of it now, not as burden, but as something that actually held shape. Something with structure. A life, finally, that had structure. It was the second week of December when she understood something was different. She did not make a dramatic discovery of it, because she was not a dramatic person, and her body gave her the information quietly and incrementally, the way she'd come to expect information at Blackridge to arrive. A morning when coffee tasted wrong. Then a week when her body felt not sick exactly, but unfamiliar, as if it had made a decision without consulting her fully. She lay in the dark and thought about it with the same careful, systematic quality she brought to kitchen inventories and ledger discrepancies. And by the third week of December, she was fairly certain she was not wrong. She did not tell Dane immediately, not because she was afraid to tell him. She had been afraid of things in this house, and this was not one of them. It was something more like needing to hold it herself for a short while first, to let it be real in her own body and her own mind before it became real in the larger world of the ranch and the people in it. She gave herself 4 days of private knowing, which was all she could sustain before the weight of carrying something significant alone became less comfortable than sharing it. She told him on a Tuesday evening. They were in the kitchen, which was where most of the important things between them had happened. At the kitchen table, in the warm and ordinary light, the stove doing its steady work behind her. He was drinking coffee and she had her hands around her own cup, and she said, without preamble, because preamble had never been her style, "I think we're going to have a child." He was very still. She watched his face. She had gotten good at reading his face, better than she'd been at reading anyone else's, because his face was a face that required reading. It didn't offer itself up. What she saw move through it in the space of a few seconds was something she would think about for a long time afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real and complicated and very human. First, something sharp and almost frightened, the instinct of a man who associated pregnancy with loss, and could not, at the first moment, separate the old terror from the new information. Then something else coming behind it, slower and deeper, working its way up through the fear like water finding a path through stone. "You're certain?" he said. His voice was careful in a specific way. "Not completely," she said. "But I think so. I'll ask Dr. Harmon to come out." He was quiet. She let him be quiet because she had learned this was what he needed, and she was not afraid of his silences anymore. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. He stopped. He put his cup down. He looked at his hands on the table and then at her. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to know I'm saying it honestly." "All right," she said. "I'm terrified," he said. "Right now, in this moment, I am, that's the word, terrified." He said it without apology or self-protection, which was, she had come to understand, his version of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to name it directly. "And I also, underneath that," he stopped again, searching. "Clara, I thought this was something that was finished for me. I thought that part of imagining a future, of..." He pressed his lips together. "I had stopped letting myself think about it." "I know," she said again. And now, he looked at her, and the expression on his face was not happiness exactly, not yet, because the fear was still too close and too large. But it was something in the same territory, something that was trying to be what it was, and fighting through the debris of the past to get there. "I want this," he said. I want this very much. I need you to know that." "I know that too," she said. He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, and he held it in the way he'd held it under the cottonwoods in May and on the porch in summer, the way that said everything he couldn't organize into sentences. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him. "The same things I always need," she said, "which you already know." He nodded. The fear was still in his face, and it did not go away that evening or the next morning or in the days that followed, but it sat alongside something else now, and the something else was real, and it grew. Oh, Dr. Harmon confirmed it in the 3rd week of December, with the matter-of-fact manner of a man who had delivered a great deal of news of all varieties over a long career and had decided that equanimity was more useful than theatrics in either direction. "April, I'd estimate," he said after his examination, washing his hands at the kitchen basin. "Beginning of May at the latest." "She should rest more than she has been," Dane said from the doorway, which was where he had been standing for the past 20 minutes. "I don't need to rest more," Clara said. "You work from before 5 in the morning." "I've worked from before 5 since September of last year," she said. "Nothing has changed." Dr. Harmon looked between them with the expression of a man who had also seen a great many domestic negotiations over a long career. "Light work is fine," he said diplomatically. "Common sense applies. She'll know when she needs to slow down." He looked at Clara specifically. "You'll know." "Yes," she said, "I will." Dane looked like he had more to say about this and had decided with visible effort that Dr. Harmon's word was going to have to be sufficient. After the doctor left, he came to stand in the kitchen with her in the way he sometimes did when he had something he wanted to say and was deciding how to say it. She waited. "I'm going to worry," he said. "I know," she said, "probably more than is reasonable." "Almost certainly," she said, "and you're going to tell me when that becomes a problem." I'm going to tell you when that becomes a problem, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. Good. He poured himself coffee and sat down at the table, and that was the agreement, which was how their agreements usually worked. Not elaborated, not ceremonied, just made and then held to. She told the household at dinner the following Sunday, because keeping it from people who lived at close quarters was neither practical nor something she wanted to do. The announcement landed differently on different people. Garrett nodded once with the expression of a man who was filing important information in the correct category. Hobbs said something that was warm and possibly off-color and then looked at Dane and revised it. Alvaro told her in careful English that his mother had 8 children and all of them were fine, which she took as the reassurance it was intended to be. Roy said, to his plate, "That's good news," and returned to his food, which for Roy was the equivalent of a speech. Pete didn't say anything immediately. He was sitting at his usual place, and he went still when she said it, and she caught his eye across the table, and he looked away and then back at his food, and she thought she understood. He was 14, or close to it, and he had spent 7 years as the only child-adjacent person in this household, and some part of him had just heard something that might mean his position in it was changing. She didn't address it at the table. Later, when the others had gone, she found him in the barn with Compass on the pretext of checking the mare's water, which she had checked an hour earlier. He was brushing the horse's mane with the focused attention of someone who was not actually thinking about what his hands were doing. "Pete," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Look at me." He looked up. His face had that quality young people's faces had when they were feeling something large and hadn't yet developed the adult machinery to flatten it into something more manageable. "You know things don't change between us," she said. He shrugged, which was a 14-year-old's way of saying he wasn't sure he believed that, but didn't want to be seen needing reassurance. "I mean that," she said. "The whole reason I'm telling you is because you're family, not the help, not a hand on the ranch. Family." He looked at Compass, then at his hands on the brush. "What if you don't need me as much?" he said. "When there's a baby to look after?" She thought about how to answer this honestly, because he deserved honesty, and not just comfort. "A baby doesn't need what you need," she said. "A baby needs feeding and sleeping. You need someone who sees you. That doesn't go away because there's a baby." She paused. "You've been here since you were 7 years old. Nobody's going to forget that." He was quiet for a while. Compass stood patiently under the brush. "I could help," he said finally. "With the baby. I mean, when it's older, teaching it things." "Teaching it things," Clara said. "Like what?" He looked a little defensive. "I know things." "You absolutely do," she said, and meant it. He went back to brushing the horse, and the particular tension in his shoulders had eased, and she stood there for a moment more before she went back to the house, and she thought about what he'd said. "I could help." And she thought that this was one of the things she had never fully understood about belonging until she'd lived inside it. That it was not a thing you declared or were given, but a thing you built through small repeated acts of choosing each other. And that Pete had been making that choice for years without knowing how to name it. She knew how to name it now. Winter closed around Blackridge the way it always did, serious and complete. And inside the house, things were warmer than they'd been the previous year in every sense of the word. The kitchen was the center of it, as it had always been. But it was a different center now, fuller in some quality she couldn't have named precisely. Something had been added to the warmth that was not just heat. January brought a week of cold that was the worst she'd seen, temperatures that made the air shimmer and creak, that frosted the inside of the windows and turned the walk from the house to the barn into something you prepared for. During that week, the household pulled in close and became, for those days, almost entirely interior. She cooked things that took all day, braises, soups, a bread project that kept the stove going from morning to late afternoon. The men came in with cold on their coats and stood near the kitchen doorway breathing in the warmth before they could remove their layers. Dane came in at midday, which he rarely did, and stood at the stove with his hands around a cup and said nothing for 5 minutes, which she'd learned was his version of needing comfort without asking for it. She refilled his cup without being asked. He said thank you and went back out. In the evenings of that cold week, he sat with her in the kitchen longer than usual, and she noticed that he was watchful in a new way. Not the watchfulness of before, the careful management of distance, but something else. He watched her the way you watched something you were afraid of losing, which was both understandable given his history and something she intended to address directly when the moment was right. The moment came on the fourth night of the cold week, when the temperature outside had dropped to something theoretical and the house had contracted into its warmest, most interior self. She was at the table, and he was across from her with a book he hadn't been reading, and she put down what she was doing and said, "I'm not Eleanor." He looked up. "I'm not saying that to be unkind," she said. "I'm saying it because I think part of what you're afraid of is that history repeats, that losing someone you love is something that simply happens to you, the way weather happens. And I need you to know I understand why you think that, and also that it is not a useful way to live." He was quiet. "I'm healthy," she said. "Dr. Harmon says so. The ranch is not as isolated as it was 5 years ago. The road's better. There are 2 more families within reasonable distance than there were then, and you know how to get help faster than you did." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to promise you nothing will ever go wrong, because that would be a lie, and you don't want my lies. But I'm going to tell you that sitting across from me and watching me like I might disappear at any moment is not something I'm going to let you do for 6 months." His mouth was straight, and she could see him receiving this, not easily, but honestly. "What do you want me to do instead?" he said. "Be here," she said. "Not watching and waiting. Actually, here." A long silence. "That's harder than it sounds," he said. "I know," she said. "Most things worth doing are." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he put the book he hadn't been reading on the table and reached over and put his hand on hers, and she turned her hand over and held it. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I'm asking," she said. It was not a resolution. She understood that. He was not going to stop being afraid overnight because she'd asked him to. The fear was woven into him too deeply for a conversation to dissolve it. But he was a person who kept his word, which she had known since before she understood what it meant to know something about a person, and trying meant something from him. She went to bed that night and lay in the cold, dark quiet, and she thought about what it meant to love someone who was afraid. Not afraid of you, but afraid of the fact of you, of what it would cost them if you went. She'd never thought about love quite that way before Blackridge, as something that could be both gift and terror simultaneously. It seemed to her now that this was actually the most honest form of it, the version that said, "This matters enough to be frightening." She could live with frightening if the mattering was real. Spring came twice to her that year. The first time was in late March, when the snow started pulling back from the south-facing slopes and the mud season began and the first tentative green appeared at the base of the dead grass. The second time was in the last week of April, at 3 in the morning, when Dr. Harmon was there and Dane was in the hallway outside the bedroom door. And Clara worked at the hardest thing she had ever done with the same quality of focused, unhurried determination she'd brought to every hard thing in her life, which was less about courage than about simply not seeing any alternative to forward. The baby arrived in the very early morning, just before the sky started to lighten. A girl. She was small and completely furious about being where she was, and she announced this so thoroughly that even Dane, in the hallway, heard it, and Dr. Harmon laughed. A genuine laugh, the laugh of a man who had heard that sound 100 times and still found it remarkable, and said, "She's healthy. She's absolutely fine." Dane came through the door and stopped. He had the look of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and had just been shown that the thing they feared had not, this time, come to pass. And the look was not triumph or even simple relief. It was more like someone who had braced for a blow and instead been handed something warm, and the adjustment from one to the other required a moment. Clara was tired in a way she had never been tired. She was also more completely awake than she could remember being. "Come here," she said. He came. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the baby, and she watched his face go through several things in sequence, none of them simple, and then settle into something that was quieter and more certain than anything she'd seen from him before. He reached out one hand, careful, the way his hands were always careful, and the baby's fingers closed around one of his with the involuntary, absolute grip of something that has just arrived in the world and is not sure of anything except holding on. He sat very still. "Dane?" Clara said. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet, which she had not seen before and did not comment on. "What do you want to name her?" she said. He looked back at the baby. He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know," he said. "Think." He stopped. "Something that's hers, something new." "Yes," Clara said. "That's what I think too." They named her Ruth, not after anyone, just a name that felt solid and real and equal to the task of being carried through a life. The spring and summer that followed were not easy in the way that springs and summers with a newborn at a working ranch are not easy, which is to say, they were complicated and exhausting and intermittently wonderful and full of the specific comedy and difficulty of new things. Clara had not raised a child before. Dane had not either, not through infancy, not all the way through. They made mistakes that were obvious in hindsight and some that were not obvious at all. Ruth had strong opinions about everything and expressed them continuously and with great commitment. Pete was remarkable. She hadn't fully predicted this. He had offered, back in December, to help when the baby was older and could be taught things. What she hadn't anticipated was how completely he threw himself into the immediate problem of a baby that needed things now. Fetching water, rocking Ruth in the kitchen while Clara cooked, holding her with the careful competence of someone who had decided this was a skill worth acquiring and had simply acquired it. He was 14, and he was awkward about most things in the way of 14-year-olds. But with Ruth, he was not awkward. He was patient in a way Clara hadn't known he was capable of, and she thought about the 7 years he'd spent largely unparented and understood that perhaps he'd had some ideas stored up about what good care looked like. Dane watched Pete with Ruth and said, one evening, "He's going to be fine." "He was always going to be fine," Clara said. "He just needed someone to tell him." "Is that all it takes?" He said it without irony, genuinely. "Sometimes," she said. "Sometimes that's the whole of it." The accounting of the Warren Colby matter closed out in June of that year. The legal process had recovered a portion of what had been taken, not all of it, because some of it was genuinely gone, but enough to matter, and the county land lease adjustments that Colby had falsified were reversed, restoring the proper terms to the ranch's operating costs going forward. Dane had told her about it over dinner one evening, in the same quiet, factual way he delivered most information, and she'd watched his face while he told her, and seen that the anger had mostly burned out of it. What was left was something more like resolution, not forgiveness, which was too clean a word for the complicated thing it actually was, but the settled acknowledgement of a person who has dealt with a difficult fact and is no longer waiting for it to resolve. "It's done," he said. "Yes," she said. "The ranch is—" He paused. "Healthier than it was, financially, than it's been in a while." "I know," she said. "I've been doing the accounts." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to love, the one that was almost dry, almost amused. "I know you have." "You've known?" "Clara," he said, "you reorganized the ledger system in February, and I haven't had to look for anything since. Of course I know." She looked at him. He was drinking his coffee with the expression of a man who was content, which on Dane Mercer was a subtle thing. No performance, no declaration, just a quality of presence that said all the pieces were where they should be. "Good," she said, and went back to her own coffee. September came, and the anniversary with it, and Dane was quiet in the way she'd learned to expect. She let him be quiet and made no demands on the day, and in the afternoon, without discussion, they rode up to the cottonwoods together. Ruth with Clara in front of the saddle, 7 months old and extremely interested in the horse's mane, and Dane on his own horse beside them. They stood at the marker for a while, and Ruth grabbed at the grass near the stone, with the focused intensity of someone who has recently discovered that the world is full of things that can be grabbed, and Clara held her steady and let her, and the cottonwoods moved above them in the September wind. "She should know," Dane said, "when she's old enough. About Eleanor. About James." "Of course," Clara said. "I don't want it to be a secret. I don't want her to find out some other way and feel like there was something—" "There's nothing hidden here," Clara said. "You don't hide things. It's one of the things about you." He looked at her. "I hid for 5 years." "That's different from hiding things," she said. "That was hiding yourself." She shifted Ruth in her arms. "You stopped." He was quiet for a moment. "I had help," he said. She didn't say anything to that because it didn't need anything said. They rode back down the ridge in the late afternoon, the shadows of the horses long in front of them, and Blackridge was below them with the smoke coming from the kitchen chimney and the sound of work coming from the barn, and the entire particular fact of a life that was being lived daily and imperfectly and with full commitment. The first real snow of that second winter came in November, earlier than usual, overnight and quiet, and Clara found it in the morning when she went to the kitchen window before she'd even started the fire. 14 inches, maybe more, with the sky still going and the world white and simplified in the particular way she now knew well. The ranch's rough edges buried under something clean, the fence posts shortened to their crossbars, the mountains above the valley hidden behind cloud. She put more wood on the fire. She started the coffee. Ruth was asleep still, which gave her an hour, maybe slightly more, and she used it the way she used every early morning, standing in the kitchen that was her own, in the house that was her own, on a ranch that she had come to as a person with $11.30 and a 4-line newspaper advertisement and nothing else left. She thought about what a year was, what 2 years were. She thought about the woman who had sat on a train watching the horizon, not quite afraid and not quite hopeful. And she thought about what she would tell that woman if she could reach back to her. She wouldn't tell her about the storm, or the shoulder, or the ledger, or the boxes with the initials. She wouldn't tell her about the kitchen, or the creek, or the cottonwoods, or the April morning when a furious new person had arrived and rearranged everything. Those were things that needed to be lived rather than told. What she would tell her was simpler than any of that, and she had arrived at it the slow way, the only way that actually worked, through the daily accumulation of specific ordinary moments that no one around you could see were building into something. She would tell her the things you build through showing up day after day, with your hands and your attention and your stubbornness intact. Those are the things that last. Not because they're dramatic, because they're real, because they're made of actual material, the kind of material that holds through winter and recovers from storm and grows back when it's been pressed into the mud. She would tell her, "You will be afraid. That doesn't stop. You don't grow past it. What happens is that you get better at staying anyway." And she would tell her, "Go, get on the train. You don't know what you're going toward, but that's not the same as having nothing. It has never been the same as having nothing." She heard Ruth upstairs, the first sounds of waking. Not crying yet, just the beginning of waking, the sounds of someone returning to the world and finding it still there. She heard Dane's footsteps in the hall above her. She heard the sound of Pete in the bunkhouse, a door, someone's voice calling something across the yard. She heard Blackridge Ranch begin its day, the sounds of it assembling around her the way they did every morning. The barn doors, the horses, Garrett's voice giving the first instructions, the particular creak of the porch steps that she had asked to be fixed and that had not yet been fixed, and that she had stopped being bothered by because some things at Blackridge simply were what they were. Dane came downstairs with Ruth against his shoulder, the baby already more interested in the kitchen than in sleeping, reaching for the light with one hand. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the window and the snow beyond it with the expression of a man assessing what the day was going to require. "Heavy," he said. "Yes," she said. "Sit. Coffee's ready." He sat. She poured. Ruth grabbed at the cup and he moved it out of reach, and she expressed her opinion on this thoroughly and without ambiguity, and he told her she would have to wait, and she declined to accept this answer. And Clara listened to the two of them having this argument that Ruth was never going to win while she sliced bread and thought about nothing in particular and everything at once. The snow came down outside the kitchen window, soft and steady and without urgency. The stove was warm at her back. The coffee was good. This was not the life she had planned, because she had not known how to plan it. It was better than planning. It was the life that had been built by two people who'd both arrived at the same place with their histories and their fears and their particular stubbornness, and had decided, each in their own careful way, that building was worth doing. That was all it had been, in the end. A decision made and then remade every day. Not once and permanently, but daily, the way you banked a fire. Not because it would burn forever on its own, but because tending was what kept the warmth alive. She put the bread on the table. She sat across from her husband and her daughter, and the snow fell on Blackridge Ranch outside the window, and the day began.